person today anymore, but you're hearing the committee has a taped deposition of him?
Yeah, the committee, as you know, Diane, has done over 1,000 of these taped depositions. One of those was with Bill Stepien. I'm told it was a rather detailed and lengthy deposition. They have the questions that they would have been asking him at this live hearing on tape at that closed deposition, and you, I am sure, will be hearing extended excerpts of Stepien. And what you're going to be hearing is that Stepien, who was the campaign manager, had told Donald Trump repeatedly, beginning on election night, that his efforts to challenge the results were highly unlikely to succeed. Not just Stepien, but other senior members of that campaign team. I assume you'll also hear from them in some of those taped depositions. So the point here is not just that Donald Trump was lying about the election, but that he knew he was lying about the election. He knew that he had lost the election because that was what he was told by the top people on his campaign. And instead of listening to them, he decided to go with the opinions, the rather wild conspiratorial opinions of his outside legal advisors, people like Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell.
So, Rachel, how does this change the committee's plans then and the impact of today if they don't have Stepien in person, but they do have this taped deposition?
Well, listen, Diane, I think this is a delay that the committee did not want. They wanted Stepien to be in the hot seat today. They were looking at him as sort of a star witness. Now, Republican Liz Cheney, who is one of the two Republicans on this committee, she did just speak to reporters saying that the American people will still see new information that they have not heard before because, as John said, they do have those taped depositions from behind closed doors with Stepien that they do plan to play at today's hearing. But still, she is promising that this hearing will be effective. She says that they are committed to bringing this forward and getting this across the finish line, even though Stepien will not be there in person. We're told that his counsel will be giving an on-the-record statement, Diane.
Jonathan, Congressman Jamie Raskin has already said he wants to see the Justice Department investigate any credible allegation of criminal activity on the part of Donald Trump or anyone else. How likely do you think that is to happen, and what could that look like?
Well, you know, that is the big question, and it's a decision that ultimately will be made by the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. You know, for a crime to be prosecutable, you have to have two things happen. You have to prove that something wrong was done, something in violation of the law, and you have to prove that the person doing it in many cases knew knew that this was in fact a violation of the law, knew that what he was doing was wrong. And that in effect is a point of this hearing, is to show not just that Donald Trump was saying things that were not true, that were disproven about the election, but that he knew full well that they were untrue, and then went and carried out a series of actions that were effectively an effort to overturn those election results, to cling to power. That is a potential crime. Whether or not it's prosecutable, whether or not Merrick Garland decides to do something we've never seen in American history, which is prosecuting a former president, I frankly have no idea. There's no indication yet that the Justice Department has moved in that direction. And I think this committee knows that that's not the only point here, though, despite what Raskin said, that the point here is to demonstrate for the public the truth about what happened and Donald Trump's responsibility for it.
And John, the other big witness today is former Fox News political editor Chris Stirewalt. He was fired after the network faced backlash for calling Arizona early for Joe Biden. Why call him? What's the committee trying to get at here?
Well, first of all, I think it's interesting to note that of the 5 witnesses scheduled for today, now it is 4. All were Republicans, plus Stirewalt. I don't know if he's a Republican or a Democrat, but he was a longtime political analyst for Fox News. The committee is very much trying to reach out to the people who have come to believe what Donald Trump has said about the election and about January 6th. And they know that the most effective way to do that is through Republican voices, not Democrats, you know, going on and what might seem like a partisan thing. So I think part of it is you know, Stirewalt was was a very respected Fox analyst. He was very much part of Fox's decision-making on election night. As you remember, Fox was the first television network to call Arizona to say that Joe Biden had won Arizona. And Fox, over the ensuing several days, did what all the other networks did, which is ultimately on November 7th declare that Joe Biden had won the election and was the president-elect. So I think you'll hear some discussion of that decision-making and also the pressure that Fox was under, hearing from members of the Trump inner circle trying to get them to reverse those decisions.
And Rachel Steyerwalt, I think just this morning he came out with a blog sort of explaining why he chose to testify today. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to John's point here when you look at the panel of witnesses about the committee trying to make that appeal to conservative voters, to conservative voices across the country. So you have Steyerwalt penning this op-ed about why he decided to show up and testify today at these hearings in a conservative outlet called The Dispatch. And he says that all he could really do is come forward and tell the truth. As uncomfortable as it is for him, he says as a journalist to be sitting in that chair today, he says he didn't really have any other grounds to say no to this. So he wanted to comply with the committee's requests, but he does note here that he does not want to ever again feel the wrath that he felt after calling Arizona for President Joe Biden at Fox News. He said that was something that he felt immediately afterwards at Fox News. And I think today, this conservative voice talking about what it was like for him and the pressure that he was under potentially at Fox News to push this narrative from the former president may be interesting, but also may be enlightening to a lot of conservative voters out there.
John, do you think it changes things at all that Bill Stepien, who we now won't hear from in person today, was due to appear under subpoena?
Well, I think that the reason why he was due to under subpoena is because, he still is very much part of the Trump orbit. As a matter of fact, one of the fascinating things about all of this is Stepien is actually a paid consultant to the Trump-endorsed candidate who is running against Liz Cheney in the Republican primary in Wyoming. Liz Cheney, obviously, the vice chair of this committee. So, Stepien is not a friendly witness, but the committee believes that he did tell the truth in his tape deposition. But he's also not the kind of person who's going to come in voluntarily. But of course, he could have tried, like others in Trump's orbit, to fight this subpoena. He did not. He was subpoenaed, and he agreed to appear. Now, of course, he's got a family emergency, so he won't be here live.
And Rachel, thanks to John's reporting, we now know that the committee does have taped depositions of Stepien, so I'm sure we're expecting to see at least some of that today. But we also saw video clips of testimony from former Attorney General Bill Barr and Ivanka Trump in the first hearing. Do you think we'll see more of that today?
I think we got a small taste of what we can expect over the course of the next several hearings as they play out through the month of June. This is something that the Democrats and the two Republicans on this committee believe is going to be used to their advantage. These taped behind closed doors depositions from Trump's most inner circle, the former Attorney General Bill Barr, even the former president's own daughter, Ivanka Trump, saying that she believed Attorney General Bill Barr when he said that the election was not stolen, when he said that he did not see anything out there, any sort of evidence that would have suggested that the results could have been changed to tip the election in former President Donald Trump's favor. Now, of course, we know that the former president, continued to ask his aides and allies to look for evidence that just did not exist. And even when he was told that the election was not rigged, that he in fact lost this election, he continued to push this forward. And what Democrats and the two Republicans on this committee say ended with, really just January 6th happening, this attempt to siege and take over democracy. And so I think that's the key point here also that the committee is trying to make, that this is not just about looking backwards, right? This is about also looking forward, looking at how close our democracy was to potentially unraveling, Diane.
All right, Rachel Scott, Jonathan Karl, thank you both. And we will bring you live coverage of today's hearing as soon as it begins. We'll be right back.
America's #1 news, ABC News. Most watched, most trusted, and streaming live to you anytime, anywhere, and free. This is ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Free to you 24/7. Watch America's #1 news whenever you want it, wherever you are, anytime. ABC News Live, streaming live and free on all platforms. More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. Take America's #1 news with you, anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now. It's Elvis Week on GMA with the stars of the movie and Priscilla.
Good morning, America.
And Chris, Kiki, Antonio, Jeff, Haley, and Pitbull. All on GMA.
We know who we are, where we come from, and where we belong.
This is the story of how we lived, how we survived for thousands of years.
We're still maintaining our culture, and we're fighting for it, generation after generation.
It's important to pass these skills on.
We make it work out here.
Something very beautiful about it.
What do you want the world to know about Hunter Biden?
GMA tomorrow.
At what point in your marriage did you realize that Hunter had a drinking problem?
Exclusive.
What has, if anything, Hunter said about you writing this book?
The emotional and deeply personal first TV interview.
This is not a story about who's right and who's wrong. This is my story, the story of Kathleen Buell.
Breaks tomorrow on Good Morning America.
We were creating the perfect Mormon family. And then I fell in love with my friend.
Yeah, I'm like stupidly in love with her.
Leaving the church was leaving who I was. The lesbian ex-Mormon story is not something that's been shared very much, but I feel like our story needs to be told. What nobody tells you when you're Mormon is that there actually is another way.
The King of the Water is back. What? Nat Geo Shark Fest is celebrating 10 years with 4 weeks.
Doesn't get much better than this.
27 new premieres and more platforms than ever before. We know sharks. We know experts.
This should give us some really good data.
Whoa. We know you can't get enough. Shark Fest starts Sunday, July 10th.
On Nat Geo and Disney Plus.
Friday night on ABC.
This is not only a news story, it's a sports celebrity story. Greed, false trails, cold-blooded murder.
How could you have murdered my son?
Now, shocking new revelations.
Are you kidding me?
All new details.
Just wow.
And now, after 12 long years, there's a verdict, and a grieving mother finally has some answers.
The 2020 event, Friday at 9/8 Central on ABC.
No one was prepared for what would come next.
If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
We're coming back on the air right now because we've just learned that those protesters you saw on the Capitol steps just moments ago have now breached the Capitol, are now inside the Capitol.
We face what many would view the most direct threat to the grand experiment called democracy in our lifetime.
The horror and chaos and the sadness over what has played out at our nation's capital. Images not seen in modern American history.
From ABC News Live, Attack on the Capitol, The Investigation. Here now, Diane Macedo.
Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. The second high-stakes hearing on the Capitol insurrection is set to get underway without today's star witness. Bill Stepien, Donald Trump's former campaign manager, is now unable to testify today because his wife has gone into labor. Members of the January 6th committee are still expected to question 4 other witnesses, including former Fox News political director Chris Direwalt. Committee members say today's hearing will focus on establishing that former President Trump and his legal team knew he lost the election, but tried to hold on to the presidency anyway. And we have full team coverage. Let's bring in White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks on Capitol Hill, ABC News political director Rick Klein, along with our ABC News contributors, legal analyst Kim Whaley, former Republican Congresswoman Barbara Comstock of Virginia. Thank you all for being here. Rick, I want to start with you. How significant is Stepien's absence from the hearing today?
It's certainly a curveball. He was the main person that members of this committee wanted to hear from because they felt like he could establish that Donald Trump knew that he lost. That's the whole theme of today's election, is that Trump and those around him knew that he lost, that the campaign manager and top aides around the president all knew that he lost, and that he continued to spread misinformation and lies and put together a conspiracy to overthrow the election despite all that. Now, it doesn't mean that all is for naught out of today. We know that Bill Stepien spoke to the committee in taped depositions. We understand from committee members that they're likely to play portions of those to kind of stand in for what his testimony would have been. There was some unpredictability about what exactly he would say. By all accounts, he's still pretty loyal to the former president. In fact, Bill Stepien is on the campaign payroll of the primary challenger who's running against Liz Cheney in Wyoming. So it's not expected that Bill Stepien was going to try to throw Trump and those around him under the bus. But by laying out the facts as he knew them on that night, it would have been a powerful addition to what we've already heard and what we're going to continue to hear around how Trump was told and knew definitively that the election was over.
Mary Alice, how does this change the committee's strategy today?
Yeah, well, to Rick's point, I think we're probably going to have a lot more video evidence, a lot more multimedia components to this hearing. They're probably also going to lean more heavily on some of the other witnesses. We're also going to hear from this former Fox political editor who defended the network's decision, Fox's decision to accurately call Joe Biden as the winner of Arizona right after the election day. You know, he claims that he was fired from Fox right after that, and I imagine that the committee is going to lean heavily into his testimony and perhaps even sort of expand upon what he was set to testify. You know, he's going to probably face questions about what some of his other former colleagues at Fox knew about. You know, we've heard names of Fox, big names from Fox, come up in previous conversations around the committee's work. Were they texting with the former president? Were they texting with the former chief of staff? They have been such a big part of continuing and being a platform that's allowed, you know, people close to the former president continue with his conspiracy theories, continues with his fraud claims. And then we're expecting the second panel that will have local election officials, some election officials that really tried to investigate claims of fraud but didn't find any. I imagine the committee will again sort of lean heavily on these other witnesses planned for today.
So, Kim, how important is it for the committee to prove that former President Trump knew that these claims that the election was stolen were false? And how do you think they'll go about doing that, especially with Stepien no longer testifying in person?
The distinction between civil liability for money damages and criminal liability often boils down to this idea of knowledge or intent. So they're laying a groundwork potentially for referral to the Department of Justice, speaking to prosecutors and speaking to the American people about the president's state of mind. Was he aware that this is potentially a crime? Was he taking acts in furtherance of what the Justice Department believes already was a seditious conspiracy? It was a conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. We know that because the Justice Department has issued indictments to Proud Boys and Oath Keepers around that. So the big question is who else, if anyone, was involved in that broad conspiracy? Now, as far as the sort of change up today, 1,000 witnesses, you know, prosecutors and lawyers oftentimes have to submit testimony through depositions. If you have a witness who dies before trial, that happens. It's better to have it in real time. People pay more attention, but I don't think this is going to substantially shift the arc of the narrative here, and we will see additional witnesses. I'd like to hear from Bill Barr himself or Ivanka Trump. They might not be willing to even comply with the subpoena, which might be how the committee is deciding who to actually call. Ones that are going to make it difficult, and those that are saying, listen, I will testify even though politically it's not good for me.
Now, Barbara, the committee said several Republican congressmen reached out to the White House after January 6th seeking pardons. What do you make of that?
Well, that certainly was one of the most troubling revelations from the first day of hearings, and you've had numerous members of the committee that have said they have information to that effect, and I imagine they will have. And as for today, you know, having in a past life, I was a chief counsel on an investigative committee in the Clinton years. And I know as the person who had to be in charge of various witnesses, you know exactly what you want to get out of that witness. So I imagine today we will still get the information from the questions they asked Bill Stepien, the answers he gave. It's on video, so that whoever was in charge of that is going to be able, scrambling to put that, but they'll still be able to tell that story. And then it's going to be supplemented by people like Chris Stirewalt and Ben Ginsburg and the others who are testifying, who know this was sort of the beginning of the big lie. Donald Trump was told it was a lie, and he perpetuated it. And that's why I imagine people who were involved in his big lie wanted to have a pardon.
And Rick, these hearings would look very different if Democrats were not in the majority. They may not even be happening at all. We know that there's a significant number of Republicans who do believe that Donald Trump won that election. Less than 5 months from the midterm elections, can this committee really change minds?
I think the bar for them is to try to present information to the public and even to prosecutors and see what information gets acted on. The idea that you're going to change the narrative of the midterm elections based on this when most of the broad facts have been known for a year and a half, I don't think that's likely. I don't think many Democrats believe that to be the case. They do see it. The White House on down views this as an opportunity to outline the choice before the American people, that if this is not just about last January 6th, but it's about present and future threats to democracy, because there are people still in office or running for office this year that continue to espouse the big lie that former President Trump, if he were to run again, would do so, continuing to lie about the last election. That, I think, is more of where this committee hopes to go in terms of the ultimate impact. And you're right. They have known from the beginning, Diane, that they have a ticking clock. They are not going to exist as a committee almost certainly until as soon as the Republicans take over the House of Representatives. And if they do so, this committee itself may be the subject of an investigation. So they are always mindful of the clock, mindful of the fact that they have to get their work done in enough time to be done before the congressional elections, and let people decide, let prosecutors and let the public decide based on the evidence that's out there, plus whatever else is on people's minds.
Rick, any risk that these hearings end up backfiring on Democrats and galvanize Trump supporters even more?
I think the biggest risk is if they make a mistake or they overstep or if they do something that makes Donald Trump and people around him seem to be the victims here. Trump's going to portray himself as that anyway. He continues to send out statements calling this a witch hunt. People around him continue to campaign on the big lie, including with some elections coming up just tomorrow. But I think where this committee could make a mistake is if they go beyond where the facts are, beyond where the evidence is, become more overtly political than it already is. Bottom line, it's always going to be political. This was about an attempt to overturn an election. You can't divorce politics from that entirely, but you can present the facts, and I think most people who saw it Thursday night saw a committee that was trying to do so in a pretty sober-minded way.
And now, Mary Alice, the committee is set to hear from former Fox News political editor Chris Direwald today. Now, he was fired after backlash. The network faced backlash for calling the state of Arizona early for Joe Biden on election night. What can we expect to hear from him? Why call him?
Yeah, I think we're going to hear him explain the data, what he saw in the days right after the election, what led Fox to make that call, why he defended it. And then he, of course, claims that he was fired. So I imagine he's going to talk about the blowback he felt around Washington, from within Fox, perhaps. And it'll be very interesting if he talks about any personal blowback, personal pressure that he felt from someone in Trump's orbit. He's going to clearly face questions like that. Interesting, too, I want to note that we're getting a little bit more information about what we can expect to hear from Bill Stepien's counsel, who is going to testify in his place, who is going to be there in his place. And he's saying that he's going to lay out how Bill Stepien was a knowledgeable political operative, that he followed the data and advised the president, former president, about exactly what he saw. That was the counsel for Bill Stepien walking into the hearing room and talking to reporters on his way in. You know, again, this first panel, like we've been talking about all morning, the committee really wanting to devolve into what exactly the numbers showed. Was President Trump told that he just did not have the votes, that the numbers showed he had not won, that he had lost fair and square? And what did he decide to do with that information? What did he choose to do if so many people around him were telling him that?
And Kim, we'll also hear from a former election official in Philadelphia who defended the integrity of the election results there. What are you looking for in that testimony?
Well, across all of these witnesses, the question, as for any jury trial, is who is credible? Who sounds like they're telling the truth? An election official from within the state sort of ranks doesn't really have much incentive beyond just doing his or her job. So I think hearing from that person about the steps, the auditing procedures that are in place in every state, I don't think people understand. Fraud is very hard to pull off in an election, and it's also already a crime under federal and state law. So it happens so rarely. So to hear hear from this person how this went, how they were very careful, how they made sure that it was accurate, and then perhaps how they felt pressured to thwart the election results, could persuade some people that this is not actually fraud, that this is a legitimate process and it's worth preserving.
And Mary Alice, the other witness here, the former Attorney General who was defending the election integrity as well, how crucial will that testimony be today?
Yeah, I think Kim makes such an important point. Talking to these election officials, it reminds the American people that elections are done at the local level. That's part of what actually makes them very safe, very fraud-proof, is that every city, every state, every county has their own election process, their own set of rules, that it would be incredibly hard to hack computers, for example, all across the country. So I think it is important to sort of ground the conversation again in the facts about, just like Kim said, about how exactly we run elections in this country, and that these civil servants, these public servants, were just trying to do their job. And I was told by committee aides last night that they also want to have these witnesses explain that their teams actually did look into claims of fraud, did look into some of these accusations that they were hearing. They wanted to be thorough, but they just didn't find any evidence of widespread fraud.
And I want to quickly correct myself. I said former Attorney General. I meant U.S. Attorney. So, Rick, as we head into these hearings, what are some of the key points that you're looking out for?
The committee wants to establish that Trump knew he lost. Anything they can do in that direction, that he and people around him knew it was over, and then continue to spread a conspiracy to try to overthrow the election afterward, that is vital to today's testimony. That is the bar that they're trying to clear today as they lay out what is an elaborate series of hearings that gets at that fundamental fact.
So again, we are taking a live look there at the committee room, where we are set in just a few minutes to start hearing testimony on the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. Today's star witness, Bill Stepien, former Trump campaign manager, will not be testifying today because his wife went into labor. We will likely hear taped depositions from Bill Stepien, and we'll still hear from the day's other witnesses, including former Fox News political director Chris Stirewalt. The committee's mission today is to try to show that former President Trump knew, and his legal counsel knew, that he lost the election, and that they still then tried to claim victory. Anyway, the committee will again be using the collection of hearings to try to show that.
This is an ABC News special report.
This is now effectively a riot.
It was carnage. It was chaos.
After a bombshell hearing Thursday night.
January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup.
Right now, the committee makes its case.
President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack.
Attack on the Capitol, the investigation. Now reporting David Muir.
And good morning. We're coming on the air this morning because the January 6th committee is about to gavel back into session, the first of 3 hearings this week investigating the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. 20 million Americans watched their first primetime hearing late last week. The committee continues to lay out the findings of their nearly year-long investigation into the January 6th attack, who knew what and when, including former President Trump. The members are set to file into the chamber after presenting their first evidence about the Capitol riot in that first primetime hearing. The members today are focusing on the immediate aftermath of the 2020 election and former President Trump's efforts to remain in power, insisting the election was stolen, despite several members of his inner circle telling him he had lost and that there was no evidence to back any notion of a stolen election. You can see the chair of the committee, the vice chair, walking in. There's already news this morning, even before this hearing starts. One of the key witnesses this morning will not be testifying as scheduled. Trump's 2020 campaign manager, Bill Stepien, notifying the committee of a family emergency this morning. Our team learning that emergency is that his wife has gone into labor. Of course, we wish her well. And Mr. Stepien, his attorney, will make a statement. There was a detailed deposition, and we'll hear that instead. Let's listen to the chair, Benny Thompson, of course, Democrat of Mississippi, about to gavel back into session. This is their second hearing, the first during the day and the first of 3 this week. Let's listen. We do know that committee room is full. And here he goes.
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during today's hearing. Good morning. Last week, the Select Committee laid out a preview of our initial findings about the conspiracy overseen and directed by Donald Trump to overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election and block the transfer of power, a scheme unprecedented in American history. My colleagues and I don't want to spend time talking about ourselves during these hearings, but as someone who's run for office a few times, I can tell you at the end of a campaign, it all comes down to the numbers. The numbers tell you the winner and the loser. For the most part, the numbers don't lie. But if something doesn't add up with the numbers, you go to court to get resolution. And that's the end of the line. We accept those results. That's what it means to respect the rule of law. That's what it means to seek elective office in our democracy. Because those numbers aren't just numbers, they're votes. They're your votes. They are the will and the voice of the people. And the very least we should expect from any person seeking a position of public trust is the acceptance of the will of the people, win or lose. Donald Trump didn't. He didn't have the numbers, he went to court. He still didn't have the numbers, he lost. But he betrayed the trust of the American people. He ignored the will of the voters. He lied to his supporters and the country. And he tried to remain in office after the people had voted him out. And the courts upheld the will of the people. This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election and knew he lost an election, and as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy, an attack on the American people by trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy, and in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol sent by Donald Trump to stop the transfer of power. Today, my colleague from California, Ms. Lofgren, and our witnesses will detail the Select Committee's findings on these matters. But first, I will recognize our distinguished Vice Chair, Ms. Cheney of Wyoming, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week, as the chairman noted, our committee began outlining a 7-part plan overseen by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. Today, we will begin looking at the initial part of that plan. President Trump's effort to convince millions of Americans that the election was stolen from him by overwhelming fraud. A federal court has already reviewed elements of the committee's evidence on this point and said this, quote, "In the months following the election, numerous credible sources from the president's inner circle to agency leadership and statisticians informed President Trump and Dr. Eastman that there was no evidence of election fraud," close quote, sufficient to overturn the 2020 presidential election. The court's opinion methodically documents each of the principal reasons for that conclusion, and I would urge all those watching to read it. Today, we will begin to show the American people some of our evidence. Today, you will hear much more from former Attorney General Bill Barr's recorded testimony, and you will hear in greater detail what others in the department told President Trump, that his claims of election fraud were nonsense. You will also hear much more from President Trump's own campaign experts, who had also concluded that his fraud claims could not be supported. Let me focus briefly on just 3 points now. First, you will hear firsthand testimony that the president's campaign advisors urged him to await the counting of votes and not to declare victory on election night. The president understood even before the election that many more Biden voters had voted by mail because President Trump ignored the advice of his campaign experts and told his supporters only to vote in person. Donald Trump knew before the election that the counting of those mail-in ballots in several states would not begin until late in the day and would not be complete for multiple days. This was expected, reported, and widely known. You will also hear testimony that President Trump rejected the advice of his campaign experts on election night and instead followed the course recommended by an apparently inebriated Rudy Giuliani to just claim he won and insist that the vote counting stop, to falsely claim everything was fraudulent. He falsely told the American people that the election was not legitimate. In his words, quote, a major fraud. Millions of Americans believed him. Second, pay attention to what Donald Trump and his legal team said repeatedly about Dominion voting machines. Far-flung conspiracies with a deceased Venezuelan communist allegedly pulling the strings. This was, quote, complete nonsense, as Bill Barr said. President Trump's own campaign advisors, his Department of Justice, and his cybersecurity experts all told him the same thing. Here, for example, is White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. His view was shared by many of the Trump team whom we interviewed.
I thought the Dominion stuff was, I never saw any evidence whatsoever to sustain those allegations.
And third, as Mike Pence's staff started to get a sense for what Donald Trump had planned for January 6th, they called the campaign experts to give them a briefing on election fraud and all the other election claims. On January 2nd, the general counsel of the Trump campaign, Matthew Morgan, this is the campaign's chief lawyer, summarized what the campaign had concluded weeks earlier, that none of the arguments about fraud or anything else could actually change the outcome of the election.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
As is obvious, this was before the attack on the Capitol. The Trump campaign legal team knew there was no legitimate argument, fraud, irregularities, or anything to overturn the election. And yet President Trump went ahead with his plans for January 6th anyway. Mr. Chairman, hundreds of our countrymen have faced criminal charges. Many are serving criminal sentences because they believed what Donald Trump said about the election, and they acted on it. They came to Washington, D.C. at his request. They marched on the Capitol at his request. And hundreds of them besieged and invaded the building at the heart of our constitutional republic. As one conservative editorial board put it recently, quote, Mr. Trump betrayed his supporters by conning them on January 6th, and he is still doing it. Another conservative editorial board that has long supported President Trump said last week, Donald Trump, quote, won't stop insisting that 2020 was stolen, even though he has offered no proof that that is true. And this, Donald Trump now, quote, clings to more fantastical theories, such as Dinesh D'Souza's debunked 2,000 mules, even as recounts in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin confirm Trump lost. Those are the correct conclusions to draw from the evidence gathered by this committee. We have much more evidence to show the American people on this point than we can reasonably show in one hearing. But today, we will begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. In our opening hearing, we gave an overview of our investigation into the January 6th attack. The plot to overthrow the election was complex and had many parts, which we'll explore in remaining hearings. But today, we examine the false narrative that the 2020 election was, quote, stolen. Former President Trump's plan to overturn the election relied on a sustained effort to deceive millions of Americans with knowingly false claims of election fraud. All elements of the plot relied on convincing his supporters about these false claims. Today, we'll demonstrate the 2020 election was not stolen. The American people elected President Joe Biden. We'll present evidence that Mr. Trump's claims of election fraud were false, that he and his closest advisors knew those claims were false, but they continued to peddle them anyway, right up until the moments before a mob of Trump supporters attacked the Capitol. We'll also show that the Trump campaign used these false claims of election fraud to raise hundreds of millions of dollars from supporters who were told their donations were for the legal fight in the courts. But the Trump campaign didn't use the money for that. The big lie was also a big ripoff. The former president laid the groundwork for these false claims well in advance of the election. As early as April 2020, Mr. Trump claimed that the only way he could lose an election would be as a result of fraud.
You know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election.
This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country. This is not going to end well.
Mr. Trump decided even before the election that regardless of the facts and the truth, if he lost the election, he would claim it was rigged. Mr. Trump was right about one thing. It did not end well. On election night, Mr. Trump claimed even before the votes were counted that his loss was a result of fraud. Now, Thursday, we had testimony from Attorney General Barr about the Department of Justice investigation of Mr. Trump's fraud claims. Barr told Trump directly that his claims were BS. Yet, after hearing the truth and that warning from the AG, Mr. Trump continued to peddle the false claims of fraud. You'll hear detailed testimony from Attorney General Barr describing the various election fraud claims the Department of Justice investigated. He'll tell you how he told Mr. Trump repeatedly that there was no merit to those claims. Mr. Barr will tell us that Mr. Trump's election night claims of fraud were made without regard to the truth and before it was even possible to look for evidence of fraud. Attorney General Barr wasn't alone. You'll see and hear today other Department of Justice officials and senior advisors to Mr. Trump that they told him the claims he was making were not supported by evidence. The election fraud claims were false. Mr. Trump's closest advisors knew it. Mr. Trump knew it. That didn't stop him from pushing the false claims and urging his supporters to, quote, fight like hell, to, quote, take back their country. After he lost the election, various legal challenges were made. You'll hear testimony today from a renowned Republican election litigation lawyer who will explain the normal process by which candidates challenge an election. Rather than accept the results of the election and the decisions of the courts, Mr. Trump pursued a different strategy. He tried to convince the American people the election had been stolen. Many of his supporters believed him, and many still believe him today. The attack on January 6th was a direct and predictable result of Mr. Trump's decision to use false claims of election fraud to overturn the election and to cling to power. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I now welcome our first witness. We're joined today by former Fox News politics editor Chris Stilwell. Bill Stepien, President Trump's former campaign manager, was subpoenaed to be here and was in Washington this morning, prepared to testify. Kevin Marino, Mr. Stepien's attorney, is here with us today. Thank you, Mr. Marino, for coming. And he has advised us that Mr. Stepien's wife went into labor this morning. Mr. Stepien unexpectedly had to travel to be with his wife, and we wish him the best. Due to the depth and rigor of our investigation, we have several hours of Mr. Stepien's testimony from when we interviewed him in February, and we will be presenting that testimony today. I'll now swear in our witness. The witness will please stand and raise his right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. I want to start by showing a video that tells the story of what was going on in the Trump White House on election night in November of 2020.
Do you remember where you were on the night of the election, November the 3rd?
I was at the White House.
You know where specifically over the course of that night you spent your time within the White House?
There was an event that was organized in the residence, so I moved between the residence, a room sort of off the residence where some family members were.
I take it the president was upstairs in the residence.
He was upstairs. We were kind of on the first floor, so not upstairs. We were with mostly with Ivanka and her brothers and a couple other people who'd be coming in and out.
Can you just describe the atmosphere? What were people expecting that night when you got to the White House?
I think that there was, typically for people who show up there on election night, it's going to be a self-select, more positive environment. I think people were a little bit nervous, not knowing what was going to happen with the red wave or the red mirage as the debate was being carried out.
The Fox News Decision Desk is calling Arizona for Joe Biden. That is a big get for the Biden campaign.
Arizona's called. Do you remember that?
I do.
What do you remember happening where you were when Arizona was called?
There was surprise at the call.
Who was surprised?
Most everyone in the room.
Were you being one of them?
Yes.
Did that shift the atmosphere or the attitude in the White House?
Completely.
How so? Can you describe that?
Because Fox News was the first one to go out and say that.
So was it anger kind of directed towards Fox News for making a call more so than like disappointment that maybe the campaign lost Arizona?
All the above.
So both anger and disappointment?
Both disappointment with Fox and concern that maybe our data or our numbers weren't accurate.
Were you in the White House residence during the sort of past midnight into the early morning hours of November 4th?
Yes, oh sure. It went over beyond midnight, yes.
Do you remember Rudy Giuliani being at the White House on election night and into the early hours the next morning?
I do.
What do you remember about when he came?
He was, I had heard that he was upstairs, in that aforementioned reception area. And he was looking to talk to the president. And it was suggested instead that he come talk to several of us down off the map room.
You said that you had heard that Mr. Giuliani wanted to talk to the president, and then he was directed your way. Did you end up talking to Mr. Giuliani when he was directed your way?
I did.
What was that conversation?
A lot of conversations were directed my way. A few of us, myself, Jason Miller, Justin Clark, and Mark Meadows, gathered in a room off the map room to listen to whatever Rudy presumably wanted to say to the president.
Was there anyone in that conversation who, in your observation, had too much to drink?
Like Mayor Giuliani.
Tell me more about that. What was your observation about his potential intoxication during that discussion about what the president should say when he's addressed the nation on election night?
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated, but I do not know his level of intoxication when he spoke with the president, for example.
Were you part of any discussions with the people I mentioned, Mr. Stepien, Mr. Meadows, or anyone else, about whether the president should make any sort of speech on election night?
I mean, I spoke to the president. They may have been present, but President spoke to the president several times that night.
There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we'd won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted. Ballots were still going to be counted for days. And it was far too early to be making any proclamation like that.
I remember saying that, to the best of my memory, I was saying that we should not go and declare victory until we had a better sense of the numbers.
Okay, can you be more specific about that conversation, in particular what Mayor Giuliani said, your response, and then anybody else in the room's response?
I think effectively Mayor Giuliani was saying, we won it, they're stealing it from us, where'd all the votes come from? We need to go say that we won. And essentially that anyone who didn't agree with that position was being weak.
What was your view at the time as to what he should or shouldn't say?
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted. It was becoming clear that the race would not be called on election night.
My belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race. But, we proud of the race we ran, and we, think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this, the next day or the next day, whenever we had something to say.
And did anybody who was a part of that conversation disagree with your message?
Yes.
Who was that?
The president disagreed with that. I don't recall the particular words. He thought I was wrong. He told me so, and that they were gonna, go he was gonna go in a different direction.
This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Mr. Steiwalt, did President Trump have any basis to declare victory on November 4th, 2020? Thank you. Mr. Stepien also testified that President Trump had no basis for declaring victory at that point in time.
My my belief, my recommendation was to say that votes were still being counted. It's too early to tell, too early to call the race, but we proud of the race we ran, and we think we're in good position, and we'll have more to say about this the next day or the next day whenever we had something to say.
Thank you. Mr. Stilwell, after the votes were counted, who won the presidential election of 2020?
Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. of the great state of Delaware.
Thank you. That's the bottom line. We've had an election. Mr. Trump lost, but he refused to accept the results of the democratic process. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Stilwell, I'd like you to explain a term that was thrown around a lot during the election, and that's the so-called red mirage. What does that mean?
So, in the 40 or 50 years, let's say, that Americans have increasingly chosen to vote by mail or early or absentee, Democrats prefer that method of voting more than Republicans do. So basically, in every election, Republicans win election day and Democrats win the early vote. And then you wait and start counting, and it depends on which ones you count first, but usually it's election day votes that get counted first. And you see the Republicans shoot ahead, and then the process of bailing and binding and unbinding all those mail-in votes. And some states like Pennsylvania refuse to count the votes first, so you have to wait for all of that to come in. So in every election, certainly a national election, you expect to see the Republican with a lead, but it's not really a lead. When you put together a jigsaw puzzle, it doesn't matter which piece you put in first, it ends up with the same image. So for us, who cares? But that's because no candidate had ever tried to avail themselves of this quirk in the election counting system. We had gone to pains, and I'm proud of the pains we went to make sure that we were informing viewers that this was going to happen, because the Trump campaign and the president had made it clear that they were going to try to exploit this anomaly. And we knew it was going to be bigger because the percentage of early votes was higher, right? We went from about 45% of the votes being early and absentee to, because of the pandemic, that increased by about 50%. So we knew it would be longer, we knew it would be more. So we wanted to keep telling viewers, hey, look, the number that you see here is sort of irrelevant because it's only a small percentage of these votes.
So this red mirage, that's really what you expected to happen on election night?
Happens every time.
Thank you, Mr. Stilwell. Now, I'd like to play a clip of Attorney General Bill Barr, who also explains what was expected to happen on election night.
Right out of the box on election night, the president claimed that there was major fraud underway. I mean, this happened, as far as I could tell, before there was actually any potential of looking at evidence. And it seemed to be based on the dynamic that at the end of the evening, a lot of Democratic votes came in, which changed the vote counts in certain states. And that seemed to be the basis for this broad claim that there was major fraud. And I didn't think much of that because people had been talking for weeks, and everyone understood for weeks that that was going to be what happened on election night.
Mr. Stepien obviously could not be with us today, and it's proper for him to be with his wife as they welcome their child. But he also had discussions with the president about the red mirage. That is, that it would be a long night and that early votes would favor him, but that lots more votes would be counted over the course of the night and the days after. So let's play clip 1 from our interview with Mr. Stepien.
I recounted back to that conversation with him, in which I said, just like I said in 2016 was going to be a long night. I told him in 2020 that it was going to be a process again, as the early returns are going to be positive, and we're going to be watching the returns of ballots as they rolled in thereafter.
So is it fair to say you're trying to present what you thought would be a realistic picture of what might happen over the course of that night, being election night?
That night and the days that followed. Yeah, I always told the president the truth, and I think he expected that from me, and I told him it was going to be a process. It was going to be, we had to wait and see how this turned out. So I just like I did in 2016, I did the same thing in 2020.
So let's watch a short clip of President Trump speaking after he received that information from his campaign advisors.
We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list.
So when former President Trump said that, it contradicted what his advisors had warned would happen. We all know that mail-in ballots played an important role in the 2020 election. However, President Trump continuously discouraged mail-in voting. Mr. Stepien was so concerned about the president's position on mail-in voting that in the summer of 2020, he met with President Trump along with House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Let's play clip 4.
Meeting that was had, in particular, I invited Kevin McCarthy to join the meeting, he being of like mind on the issue with me, in which we made our case for why we believed mail-in voting not to be a bad thing for his campaign. The president's mind was made up, and you understand, how many times to, go to the well on a particular topic.
Yeah, I understand. Tell me a little bit more about the argument that you and Mr. McCarthy made to the president in that meeting as to why it wasn't a bad thing that mail-in voting was available.
Largely two pillars to that argument, both of which I've previously mentioned. One, leaving a good deal to chance, pushing or urging your voters to vote only on election day leaves a lot to chance. That's A. And B, also previously mentioned, the fact that the Trump campaign, Republican National Committee, the Republican Party, had an advantage of grassroots workers and volunteers on the ground that would allow, an advantage to enhance return rates of ballots that were mailed. Those were the two pillars of the argument.
I see. And what, if anything, do you recall Representative McCarthy saying during that meeting?
We were echoing the same argument. I mean, his words echoed mine, and vice versa on those two topics.
Mr. Stirewalt, you were at the decision desk at Fox News on election night, and you called Arizona early for President Biden, which was controversial. How did you make that call, and where did you think the race stood in the early hours of the next day?
Well, it was really controversial to our competitors who we beat so badly by making the correct call first. Our decision desk was the best in the business, and I was very proud to be a part of it. Because we had partnered with the Associated Press and the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago, thanks to my colleague and friend Arnon Mishkin, had built a wonderful device for forecasting the outcomes of elections. So we had a different set of data than our competitors did. We had more research, and we had a better system, and we had a great team. So what you're waiting to see is, do the actual votes match up with the expectations in the poll? The real votes are testing the quality of your poll in targeted precincts and in targeted places. And let me tell you, our poll in Arizona was beautiful, and it was doing just what we wanted it to do, and it was cooking up just right. And at some point, and I forget exactly who, but at some point it became clear that Arizona was getting ready to make a call. So we my boss, Bill Salmon, said we're not making any call until everybody says yes, because that was always our policy, unanimity. And you have to understand, or in this room, you have, the best people from academia, Democrats, Republicans, a broad cross-section of people who had worked together for a decade, who are really serious about this stuff. So we knew it would be a consequential call because it was one of 5 states that really mattered, right? Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona were the ones that we were watching. We knew it would be significant to call any one of those 5, but we already knew Trump's chances were very small and getting smaller based on what we had seen. So we were able to make the call early. We were able to beat the competition. We looked around the room, everybody says yay, and on we go. And by the time we found out how much everybody was freaking out and losing their minds over this call, we were already trying to call the next state. We had already moved on. We were to Georgia, we were to North Carolina, we were looking at these other states. So we thought we were pleased, but not surprised.
I see. After the election, as of November 7th, in your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None. I mean, I guess it's always possible that you could have, a truckload of ballots be found somewhere, I suppose. But once you get into this space, ahead of today, I thought about what are the largest margins that could ever be overturned by a recount, and the kind of stuff that we heard Mike Pence talking about, sounding like a normal Republican that night when he said, we'll keep every challenge. Nothing like that. In a recount, you're talking about hundreds of votes. When we think about calling a race, one of the things that we would think about is it outside the margin of a recount? And when we think about that margin, we think about, in modern history, you're talking about 1,000 votes, 1,500 votes at the way, way outside. Normally, you're talking about hundreds of votes, maybe 300 votes that are going to change. So the idea that through any normal process in any of these states, remember, he had to do it thrice, right? He needed 3 of these states to change. And in order to do that, I mean, you're at an infant. You're better off to play the Powerball than to have that come in.
On November 7th, the other major news outlets called the race for President Biden. Now, Mr. Stepien told the committee that he thought the odds were, and this is a quote, very, very, very bleak, and held a meeting with the president that same day. Let's show clip 8. Video clip 8.
I mean, with each day that wore on, I mean, the trajectory of the race, on election night, Trump ahead in many states, and as that week wore on, as the 3rd became the 4th, became the 5th, and so on and so forth, and the vote by mail ballots were tabulated, Trump's lead, grew more narrow, and in some places, Biden surpassed, Trump in the vote totals. So as the week wore on, as we paid attention to those numbers multiple times a day, internally, I was feeling less confident for sure.
What was your view on the state of the election at that point?
Very, very, very bleak. We told him, the group that went over there outlined, my belief in chances for success at this point, and then we pegged it at 5, maybe 10% based on recounts that either were automatically initiated or could be initiated based on realistic legal challenges, not all the legal challenges that eventually were pursued. But it was, my belief is that it was very, very, 5 to 10%. It's not a very good, optimistic outlook.
Now, as President Trump and others continued to claim that the election was stolen, there were lawyers who were a part of the campaign lawyers, who were responsible for investigating the fraud claims. That includes Alex Cannon, who could not validate the claims that were being made, including those being made by the president. Let's roll video 13.
This is an email. It's two emails, actually. The first is from Alex Cannon to you and Faith McPherson. And then you forward that email on to Mark Meadows, Justin Clark, and Jason Miller, the subject being AZ Federal ID Voters. If you look at the original email there, it says, Bill, we completed the AZ analysis you requested. I assume that's about Arizona. And because of the substantial uncertainty surrounding the databases, this is a highly unreliable way to identify ineligible voters. Can you explain the task that you gave to Ms. Cannon for this Arizona analysis?
Sure. Previously, I described some of my frustration with some of the claims that people would throw at President Trump regarding, you need to look at this, this happened in this state or that happened in that state. And it would be, those would flow to us to look into. I talked about that before, I think.
Yep.
This is an example of that. I recall in Arizona, someone had thrown out, I believe this to be the claim, that there were thousands of illegal citizens, people not eligible to vote, having cast their ballots in Arizona. Someone had thrown out that claim to President Trump. And with, the margins being as close as they were, as I previously described, that could potentially matter. So this wild claim is thrown out, which, on its face didn't seem, realistic or possible to me. I asked Alex to look at the claim, and I haven't read this full email, but I recall the response to that. The reality of that was not illegal citizens voting in the election. I think it was like overseas voters voting in the election. So obviously, people who were eligible to vote.
When these findings were passed up the chain to President Trump, he became frustrated and he replaced the campaign's legal team. Let's play clip 14.
I think the president, it was during the second week where things like you displayed were occurring, where he was growing increasingly unhappy with his team, me less so because I was less involved at this point, but still me, growing increasingly unhappy with Justin Clark, and that kind of paved the way for Justin to be moved out and Mayor Giuliani to be moved in as the person in charge of the legal side of the campaign, and for all intents and purposes, the campaign at that point.
Now, when Mr. Stepien became campaign manager, he was the second Trump campaign manager for the 2020 race, and there were only about 115 days until Election Day. So let's play the video.
I inherited a campaign that was, the day I was hired was, I believe, President Trump's low point in the 2020 daily average polling against President Biden. It was a campaign at a low point in the polls. It was structurally and fiscally deficient. There was a great deal wrong with the campaign in both of those areas. So most of my day spent fixing and I think I took over with 115 days left in the campaign. Most of my time was spent fixing the things that could be fixed with 115 days left in the campaign.
Now, Mr. Stepien has been in the campaign field for a long time, and he worked for lots of different candidates and campaigns. He testified to this committee about his concerns given the claims that Mr. Giuliani and Ms. Powell and their team were making publicly. Let's play clip 15.
Okay, and was it important for you, Mr. Stepien, to sort of pull back just for your own professional reputation? You didn't want to be associated with some of what you were hearing from the Giuliani team and others that sort of stepped in the wake of your departure?
I didn't mind being categorized. There were two groups of, we called them kind of my team and Rudy's team. I didn't mind being characterized as being part of Team Normal, as reporters, kind of started to do around that point in time. I said, hours ago, early on that, I've been doing this for a long time, 25 years, and I've spanned, political ideologies from Trump to McCain to Bush to Christie, and, I can work under a lot of circumstances for a lot of varied, candidates and politicians, but a situation where, and I think along the way I've built up a pretty good, I hope, a good reputation for being honest and professional. And I didn't think what was happening was necessarily honest or professional at that point in time. So that led to me stepping away.
So the president did get rid of Team Normal, and I'd like to play a clip showing that the president found the people he needed to perpetuate his claims of fraud.
They saw a big truck bringing in 100,000 ballots in garbage cans, in waste paper baskets, in cardboard boxes, and in shopping baskets. And every single one of them was for Biden because they were being notified by Smartmatic in Frankfurt that Biden was way behind and they better come up with a lot more ballots. And we can prove every single thing I just said. If you gave me the paper ballots, I could probably turn around each one of these states. I'm absolutely convinced if you let me examine each one of those ballots, I'd pull out enough that were fraudulent that it would shake the hell out of the country.
It can set and run an algorithm that probably ran all over the country to take a certain percentage of votes from President Trump and flip them to President Biden, which we might never have uncovered had the votes for President Trump not been so overwhelming in so many of these states that it broke the algorithm.
I remember that one of the things Mark said at some point was, you can't show an actual vote was flipped, which I found at the time to be a remarkable assertion because you don't have to have the gun to see the body lying on the floor bleeding out with 5 bullet holes in it was killed by a gun.
What they were proposing, I thought was nuts. And the theory was also completely nuts, right? I mean, it was a combination of Italians, Germans. I mean, different things have been floating around as to who was involved. I remember Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelan. She has an affidavit from somebody who says they wrote a software in, it's something with the Philippines, and just all over the radar.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess, yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
Okay, and how did he react? How did President Trump react when you shared that view with him?
He said, I have confidence in Rudy.
I think I had conversations with probably all of our council who are signed up to assist on Election Day as they disengaged with the campaign. The general consensus was that the law firms were not comfortable making the arguments that Rudy Giuliani was making publicly. I seem to recall that I had a similar conversation with most all of them.
I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it, and that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did.
Even Sidney Powell, defending herself in a defamation lawsuit brought by Dominion Voting Systems, argued that, quote, no reasonable person would conclude that her statements were truly statements of fact. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the witness for joining us today. The first panel is now dismissed. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week, we presented the testimony of former Attorney General Bill Barr, who testified before this committee. Today, we present additional evidence, including his testimony that former President Trump started making claims of election fraud immediately after the election, and that Barr concluded the claims were untrue. Now, due to the length of Attorney General Barr's testimony, we're only going to include relevant portions at the hearing today. So let's play the video.
The department, in fact, when we received specific and credible allegations of fraud, made an effort to look into these to satisfy ourselves that they were without merit. And I was in the posture of trying to figure out, there was an avalanche of all these allegations of fraud that built up over a number of days, and it was like playing whack-a-mole because something would come out one day and then the next day it would be another issue. Also, I was influenced by the fact that all the early claims that I understood were completely bogus and silly and usually based on complete misinformation. And so I didn't consider the quality of claims right out of the box to give me any, feeling that there was really substance here.
For the first time since the election, the Attorney General spoke personally with the President on November 23rd, and this was at the White House. Let's play the video, please.
So on November 23rd, I hadn't spoken to the president since the election, and in fact, as I said, since the middle of October, roughly. And it was a little getting awkward because obviously he had lost the election and I hadn't said anything to him. And so Cipollone said, I think it's time you come over here. And so I came over to meet with the president in the Oval Office, and Meadows and Cipollone were there. And the president, and this is leading up to this conversation with Kushner, the president said there had been major fraud and that as soon as the facts were out, the results of the election would be reversed. And he went on this for quite a while, as he's prone to do. And then he got to something that I was expecting, which is to say that apparently the Department of Justice doesn't think that it has a role of looking into these fraud claims. So I said, that has to be the campaign that raises that with the state. The department doesn't take sides in elections, and the department is not an extension of your legal team. And our role is to investigate fraud, and we'll look at something if it's specific, credible, and could have affected the outcome of the election, and we're doing that. And it's just not. They're just not meritorious. They're not panning out. And as I walked out of the Oval Office, Jared was there with Dan Scavino, who ran the president's social media, and who I thought was a reasonable guy and believe is a reasonable guy. And I said, how long is he going to carry on with this stolen election stuff? Where's this going to go? And by that time, Meadows had caught up with me and leaving the office, and caught up with me and said that he said, look, I think that he's becoming more realistic and knows that there's a limit to how far he can take this. And then Jared said, yeah, we're working on this. We're working on it.
Even after his attorney general told him his claims of election fraud were false, President Trump continued to promote these claims.
I felt that things continued to deteriorate between the 23rd and the weekend of the 29th. And then on November 29th, he appeared on Maria Bartiromo's show, Sunday Futures, I believe it was. And he said that the department was missing in action.
Well, no, we had glitches where they moved thousands of votes from my account to Biden's account. And these are glitches. So they're not glitches, they're theft, they're fraud, absolute fraud. This election was over, and then they did dumps. They call them dumps, big, massive dumps in Michigan and Pennsylvania and all over. How the FBI and Department of Justice, I don't know, maybe they're involved, but how people are allowed to get away from this stuff with this stuff is unbelievable.
Now, spurred by what he saw, Barr told the Associated Press on December 1st that there was no evidence of election fraud, and immediately after Attorney General Barr's statement went public, Mr. Trump berated and he nearly fired Barr. But Barr persisted in telling the president that there was no evidence to support the fraud claims.
This got under my skin, but I also felt it was time for me to say something. So I set up a lunch with the AP reporter, Mike Balsamo, and I told him at lunch, I made this statement that to date we have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election. I had a later meeting scheduled at the White House at 3 o'clock with Meadows. This was previously scheduled, so I knew this was going to come up, and I went over there and I told my secretary that I thought I would probably be fired and told not to go home. I mean, not to go back to my office. So I said, you might have to pack up for me. And so when I got over there, I met with the chief of staff. He said the president was angry. He didn't really get into the issue of the fraud. And then I went up to Pat Cipollone's office and we were talking with each other. And word came down that he wanted us both to go to the Oval. And the president was as mad as I've ever seen him, and he was trying to control himself. And the president said, well, this is, killing me. You didn't have to say this. You must have said this because you hate Trump. You hate Trump. And then he raised the big vote dump, as he called it, in Detroit. And that, he said people saw boxes coming into the counting station at all hours of the morning and so forth. And I explained to him that at that point I knew the exact number of precincts in Detroit. I think it was 630 something. I said, Mr. President, there are 630 precincts in Detroit, and unlike elsewhere in the state, they centralized the counting process, so they're not counted in each precinct. They're moved to counting stations, and so the normal process would involve boxes coming in at all different hours. So there's nothing. And I said, did anyone point out to you, did all the people complaining about it point out to you, you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time? I mean, there's no indication of fraud in Detroit. And I told him that the stuff that his people were shoveling out to the public was bullshit. I mean, that the claims of fraud were bullshit. And, he was indignant about that. And I reiterated that they'd wasted a whole month on these claims on the Dominion voting machines, and they were idiotic claims. And I specifically raised the Dominion voting machines, which I found to be among the most disturbing allegations. Disturbing in the sense that I saw absolutely zero basis for the allegations, but they were made in such a sensational way that they obviously were influencing a lot of people, members of the public, that there was this systemic corruption in the system and that their votes didn't count and that these machines controlled by somebody else were actually determining it, which was complete nonsense. And it was being laid out there. And I told them that it was crazy stuff and they were wasting their time on that. And it was doing a grave disservice to the country.
Okay, so the very next day, the president released a video rehashing some of the very same claims that his chief law enforcement officer had told him were, quote, nonsense.
Here's an example. This is Michigan. At 6:31 in the morning, a vote dump of 149,772 votes came in unexpectedly. We were winning by a lot. That batch was received in horror. We have a company that's very suspect. Its name is Dominion. With the turn of a dial or the change of a chip, you can press a button for Trump and the vote goes to Biden. What kind of a system is this?
Barr again told the president that there was nothing to these claims on December 14th.
When I walked in, sat down, he went off on a monologue saying that there was now definitive evidence involving fraud through the Dominion machines. And a report had been prepared by a very reputable cybersecurity firm, which he identified as Allied Security Operations Group, and he held up the report, and then he asked that a copy of it be made for me. And while a copy was being made, he said, you know, this is absolute proof that the Dominion machines were rigged. The report means that I'm going to have a second term. And then he gave me a copy of the report. And as he talked more and more about it, I sat there flipping through the report and looking through it. And to be frank, it looked very amateurish to me. Didn't have the credentials of the people involved, but I didn't see any real qualifications. And the statements were made very conclusory, like, you know, these machines were designed to, you know, engage in fraud or something to that effect, but I didn't see any supporting information for it. And I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, he has, you know, lost contact with he's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. On the other hand, you know, when I went into this and would, you know, tell him how crazy some of these allegations were, there was never an indication of interest in what the actual facts were. In my opinion then, and my opinion now, is that the election was not stolen by fraud. And I haven't seen anything since the election that changes my mind on that, including the 2000 Mules movie.
Familiar with the 2000? Well, maybe you can assess that 2000 Mules, and people are talking about that.
Well, I mean, just in a nutshell, you know, I just think the GBI was unimpressed with it, and I was similarly unimpressed with it because I think I was holding my fire on that to see what the photographic evidence was, because I thought, well, hell, if they have a lot of photographs of the same person dumping a lot of ballots in different boxes, you know, that's hard to explain. So I wanted to see what the photographic evidence was, but the cell phone data is singularly unimpressive. I mean, it basically, if you take 2 million cell phones and figure out where they are physically in a big city like Atlanta or wherever, just by definition, you're going to find many hundreds of them have passed by and spent time in the vicinity of these boxes. And the premise that, if you go by a box, 5 boxes or whatever it was, that's a mule is just indefensible. It by definition, you're going to have hundreds of this. I mean, I saw one contractor said, we figured out that our truck alone would account for 6 cell phone signals. This was some kind of contractor, and our route would take us by these things on a regular basis. So but then when the movie came out, I think the photographic evidence in it was completely I mean, there was a little bit of it, but it was lacking. It didn't establish widespread illegal harvesting. The other thing is people don't understand is that it's not clear that even if you can show harvesting, that changes the results of the election. The courts are not going to throw out votes and then figure out what votes were harvested and throw them out. You'd still the burden on the challenging party to show that illegal votes were cast. Votes were the result of undue influence or bribes, or there was really, the person was non compos mentis. But absent that evidence, I just didn't see courts throwing out votes anyway. I felt that before the election, it was possible to talk sense to the president. And while you sometimes had to engage in, a big wrestling match with him, that it was possible to keep things on track, but I felt that after the election he didn't seem to be listening, and I didn't think it was that I was inclined not to stay around if he wasn't listening to advice from me or his other cabinet secretaries.
So on December 14th, Barr quit. Now, the Attorney General wasn't the only person who told the president that his claims were false. Other officials and close advisors told him the same thing.
Other than try to address a counterfactual or a hypothetical, let me just say there were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, our people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information, that's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view, and been debunked.
A month and a half or so after the election day, and at that meeting, various allegations of fraud were discussed, and Eric and Pat didn't, told the group, the president included, that none of those allegations had been substantiated to the point where they could be the basis for any litigation challenge to the election.
President Trump's own vice president and his top advisors also knew that there wasn't evidence to support the claims that the president was making.
Anyone else other than Mr. Meadows who asked you about the status outside of your legal group, Mr. Morgan and the others you mentioned, anyone else who asked you the status of what you were finding in your assessment of it?
Yes, sir.
Who's that?
Peter Navarro.
When did you talk to Mr. Navarro?
Mid-November.
Around the same time as Mr. Meadows?
Yes, sir.
And tell me about that conversation.
I recall him asking me questions about Dominion and maybe some other categories of allegations of voter fraud. And I remember telling him that I didn't believe the Dominion allegations because I thought the hand recount in Georgia would resolve any issues with a technology problem with Dominion or Dominion flipping votes. And I mentioned at that time that the CISA, Chris Krebs, had recently released a report saying that the election was secure. And I believe Mr. Navarro accused me of being an agent of the deep state working with Chris Krebs against the president. And I never took another phone call from Mr. Navarro.
Anyone else besides Mr. Meadows, Mr. Navarro, Mr. Hirschman that you had discussions with inquiring about what you were finding in your review of the allegations that were pouring in?
I believe I had about a 15-second conversation with the vice president about it as well.
When was that?
During one of the visits to the White House. I don't know which one. I think it was the first one in November. I had met him briefly at the campaign, and he remembered me and saw me. And he asked what I was doing on the campaign, and I told him that, we were looking into some of the issues related to voter fraud. And he asked me, I don't remember his exact words, but he asked me if we were finding anything. And I said that I didn't believe we were finding it, or I was not personally finding anything sufficient to alter the results of the election. And he thanked me. That was our interaction.
At a later hearing, you'll hear live testimony from the former acting Deputy Attorney General of the Department of Justice, Rich Donoghue. But now I'd like to play a portion of his testimony.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked at Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false. And then I went into, for instance, this thing from Michigan, this report about 68% error rate. Reality is it was only 0.0063% error rate, less than 1 in 15,000. So the president accepted that. He said, okay, fine, but what about the others? And again, this gets back to the point that there were so many of these allegations that when you gave him a very direct answer on one of them, he wouldn't fight us on it, but he would move to another allegation. So then I talked about a little bit about the Pennsylvania truck driver. This is another allegation that had come up. And this claim was by a truck driver who believed, perhaps honestly, that he had transported an entire tractor-trailer truck full of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania. And this was, again, out there in the public and discussed. And I essentially said, look, we looked at that allegation. We looked at both ends, both the people who load the truck and the people who unload the truck. And that allegation was not supported by the evidence. Again, he said, okay. And then he said, no, I didn't mention that one. What about the others? And I said, okay, well, with regard to Georgia, we looked at the tape, we interviewed the witnesses. There is no suitcase. The president kept fixating on this suitcase that supposedly had fraudulent ballots, and that the suitcase was rolled out from under the table. And I said, no, sir, there is no suitcase. You can watch that video over and over. There is no suitcase. There is a wheeled bin where they carry the ballots, and that's just how they move ballots around that facility. There's nothing suspicious about that at all. I told them that there was no multiple scanning of the ballots. One part of that allegation was that they were taking one ballot and scanning it through 3 or 4 or 5 times to rack up votes, presumably for Vice President Biden. I told them that the video did not support that. Then he went off on double voting at the top of the next page. He said, dead people are voting. Indians are getting paid to vote. He meant people on Native American reservations. He said there's lots of fraud going on here. Told him flat out that much of the information he's getting is false and or just not supported by the evidence. We look at the allegations, but they don't pan out.
Mr. Barr and his advisors were not the only ones who determined that the president's allegations regarding Dominion voting machines were false. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record of this hearing reports issued by the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, that addressed and rejected the claims of manipulation of voting machines in the 2020 election.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also ask unanimous consent to include in the record a report prepared by the Michigan Senate Oversight Committee that disproved claims of election fraud in Michigan, as well as a statement by 59 of the country's leading election security scientists, noting the absence of any credible evidence that the 2020 election had been altered through technical compromise, and 5 other reports from organizations and individuals confirming there was no widespread fraud in the 2020 election or describing the spread of the former president's lies.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Pursuant to the order of the committee for today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
A recess in this first hearing of the week, the first of 3. We know this is the second hearing now before the American people, the first in prime time late last week. We know last week 20 million Americans tuned in for congressional hearing on the January 6th attack on the Capitol, nearly a year-long investigation, and the level of detail revealed today significantly different from even that first night. That first night meant to be an opening statement of sorts, but today just the level of detail of questioning about what happened not only on election night, but in the days and weeks that followed, opening up a new window into what was happening both inside the White House and within the administration, and quite frankly within the campaign from several of Trump's closest advisors, and ultimately the team that won out in influencing the former president. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl. And John, I first want to begin with this window of election night itself. Quite extraordinary what we learned about election night. Hearing from Jared Kushner, hearing from obviously Bill Stepien, campaign manager, about the various places within the White House where they were watching these returns come in. And then we learned about the arrival of Rudy Giuliani late into the night, and even in front of the American people today, the testimony that Giuliani was intoxicated, had been drinking, all with competing ears for the president. And John, I was struck by the number of people, from Bill Stepien to Jason Miller to Ivanka Trump, who all believed that they should not declare victory, that it was too early to say we had won. And then they played before the American people what the former president did instead.
You know, absolutely remarkable scene, and it's one, David, that you and I saw play out on election night at 2:30 in the morning when Donald Trump came into the East Room of the White House, and while votes were still being counted in many states, he came out and declared, frankly, we did win this election, and actually said, suggested that the vote counting should stop. What we learned today was the backstory of that. Before the president came out at 2:30 in the morning to declare victory in an election when votes were still being counted and there was no victory to declare, we learned that all of the people around the president, the top levels of his campaign, all of these people from Bill Stepien on down, who not only told him that he was not winning the election, but advised him not to go out and declare victory because votes were still being counted. And in fact, the election was not going his way. And then you hear that force that Rudy Giuliani told, it was like the one person who told the president to go the other direction. And it was striking to hear senior officials on that campaign, like Jason Miller, say flatly that Rudy Giuliani appeared to be intoxicated. So the president here is listening to the advice from the intoxicated Rudy Giuliani instead of the assessment of his top campaign people and goes out and declares victory to the American people in a race that he had not won.
John Carl with us live on the Hill. John's going to be with us all day long here. And as John just is talking about, you know, one of these figures, Bill Stepien, was the campaign manager. He'd worked on several Republican campaigns in the past. He prides himself in his testimony as being able to work with all different sorts of political candidates, Donald Trump being just one of them. And he said that his advice to the former president that night would be to go out there, say the votes are still being counted. There are some good positive signs, but that we would come back to you in the next day or two when there is something to be said. There was similar advice along the way. Even Ivanka Trump said it was clear the race would not be called on election night. And then we were reminded of what John just talked about, the former president coming before the American people and declaring in those hours after the election that this has been a fraud. Frankly, we did win this election, again, despite all of the people telling him not to do that, because that simply was not the case. I want to bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Another storyline that we have reported extensively here on ABC is this notion of Bill Barr being a voice of reason. You know, he was a loyal AG to the former president, but even when the tide turned after Election Day and these stories were out there, it was Bill Barr who repeatedly said there simply is not the evidence to back this up. We knew that part of the story, but again, in this extended deposition that's been played before the American people today, I was struck, Pierre, in one particular moment where Bill Barr says, you know, boy, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, in essence, boy, if he really believes this stuff, these are some of the theories, the conspiracy theories that have been put out there, then he's really lost all contact, in the words of Bill Barr, sitting in the Oval Office, the White House, some weeks after the election when there hadn't been any communication between the AG and the president. He knew he had to go over there, and he did so in the hours after that interaction with the Associated Press reporter where Bill Barr declared before the American people himself that there simply was not evidence of any widespread fraud.
David, it's a remarkable journey. You'll recall that before the election, Bill Barr had been conducive to talking about the potential for mail fraud. We had done an interview with him that appeared on your broadcast in which we pushed back on the notion of where is this fraud that you're talking about? And Bill Barr was saying, look, this is something that needed to be considered. And then after the election, there's that critical moment where the Attorney General asked the FBI, asked the U.S. attorneys, where he asked them to look for if there was any specific credible allegations of fraud, and certainly enough to change the outcome of the election. After several days went by, the U.S. attorneys and the FBI's FBI agents went out into the field. They found nothing to speak of, nothing. And what you're hearing today is that once those results came in, the Attorney General had no option other than to go and tell the president the truth, was that, you know, his agency, which its job is to look for crimes, found none. And he told the president that, David.
Pierre Thomas with us here today. Pierre, thank you. Bill Barr again in this testimony today talking about the stories of the Dominion voting machines, of the dump of votes in Detroit, that all of that was nonsense. It was a word he used several times. And in fact, he said, does anyone point it out to you, Mr. President, that you actually did better in Detroit than you did last time around? No evidence of fraud. I want to bring in Rick Klein, our political director, because Rick, I'm sure you were watching very closely this testimony from Chris Stirewalt, formerly of Fox News, of course, fired after making that call of Arizona on election night. Two quick things here. This notion of a red mirage. We all knew that was going to happen on election night because Republican votes tend to be more day of, that they would come in first, and then the mail-in votes, which are heavily Democratic, particularly in a pandemic, also exacerbating that later count, that we all knew this was going to happen. We heard that from several members of the former president's team, that they had told the former president, you have to expect this. They knew that was coming. But what I thought was most interesting for Mr. Stirewalt, formerly of Fox, was their decision to call Arizona. And he reminded the American people that while a controversial, even though it ended up being obviously the right call, that in finding fraud, you'd have to find widespread fraud in 3 key battleground states, not just Arizona. It'd have to be Arizona, Michigan, Georgia, that you weren't talking about, you know, 100 or hundreds of votes that you would typically have if you're questioning an election, but you would be talking about thousands of votes across this country, across multiple states.
Yeah, David, fascinating because it points out the unlikelihood, if not the impossibility, of truly rigging an election in this country. And Chris Stirewalt is right. When Fox News projected Arizona for former President Trump in that election, it was a shock in our newsroom and many others because we didn't have data to back that up. We rely on a different data stream than the Associated Press and Fox News, which made those early projections. It took our decision desk several days to get to the same place. The point is, though, Fox was right, the AP were right, we were right. All of the states that were projected correctly. And the point is that that information was getting to the Trump campaign in real time. They may have disagreed, they may have quibbled with how early that call was, but they had no rationale, no basis for them to dispute the result in Arizona or Pennsylvania or Georgia. And the election landed exactly as it was anticipated to. And in fact, that night played out just like we thought it would. As you said, David, we knew that the early returns were likely to favor the Republican candidate. That's happened in the past, and it happened even more so because of the explosion in mail-in voting during COVID in so many states. And that's why you saw those numbers shift, not because of any improprieties.
Very quick follow to you, Rick, because there was such a focus at Arizona because the early nature of that call, at least in the immediate aftermath of the election. And then there was a focus, continues to be a focus on Georgia. But again, Mr. Stirewalt, formerly of Fox, making the point that you'd have to overturn the results in multiple states. And in fact, he said something along the lines of you'd have better luck playing the Powerball.
Yeah, it wasn't going to happen. And the point of today's hearing is that former President Trump knew that it wasn't going to happen. The people around him were telling him it wasn't going to happen, and he stuck by those election lies anyway.
All right, Britt Klein with us, our political director. Let's bring in Kate Shaw, our legal analyst here at ABC News. And Kate, I know you've been following very closely along with us here this afternoon, and you heard the Attorney General in his testimony saying the Justice Department stands ready in talking to the former president to investigate any widespread fraud, repeating that he had not found any evidence of that, ultimately saying this is up to the states and up to the courts. And we know, again, that the former president and the campaign did take this to the courts, but repeatedly we're told there's no evidence here.
That's right, David. So the Trump campaign and various surrogates in a number of states filed lawsuit after lawsuit in the immediate aftermath of the election, and in virtually every instance were unsuccessful. There were something like 60-plus lawsuits challenging various aspects of state elections, and the Trump campaign again and again was told by courts, state and federal, that there was no serious evidence of widespread fraud that would have changed the outcome in even a single state, let alone the 3 or more states whose results would have had to flip in order to actually change the outcome. So the courts really spoke with one voice, and yet Trump continued to say something quite different to the American public about the widespread evidence of fraud.
Our legal analyst, Kate Shaw, with us as always. Kate, thank you. And as we watch the hearing room, we will go right back to this hearing the moment it begins again. Let's bring in Rachel Scott, our congressional correspondent. And Rachel, you and I have been talking over the course of several days, even when the hearings aren't on the air, about Republicans watching this, because we know a number of them were quite vocal in the aftermath of January 6th. Talking about accountability and pointing to former President Donald Trump. Obviously, we're now some time past January 6th, and a different tone, different messaging, and few Republicans are even talking about these hearings. Are you getting any reaction?
Few Republicans are talking about these hearings, and the ones that are, David, I can tell you their message here is really twofold. On one hand, you have Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, you have Congressman Andy Biggs. They are calling this a political witch hunt. They're calling it a sham, but also at the same time, they're trying to change the focus back to President Biden and his administration and the policies, noting inflation, noting high gas prices. I think this really underscores the fine line that many Republicans are trying to walk. They lived through this insurrection. Many of them were here in this building as rioters stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th. Some even believe that the former president was responsible for it. You had Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who said that Trump provoked the mob, that he was morally responsible for what happened here on January 6th. But as we get closer to these midterm elections, and as they look to regain seats in both the House and the Senate and take over the majority, many Republicans believe the focus should not be on January 6th or the former president's false claims about the 2020 election, that it should be on President Biden and Democrats' policies.
Rachel Scott with us. Rachel, thank you as always. And just as we await them to gavel back in, I want to bring in Terry Moran, because Terry, you were watching the opening statement last week, the primetime hearing. quite striking to me, the difference today. We know what they were trying to accomplish last week, but today, just the amount of gritty detail from Bill Steppe and Jason Miller, even to Jared Kushner, who was pressed, what tact would you take? He paused in his testimony and said, I suggested to the former president, not this one, when talking about whether to go with Team Normal or the other team that began to have the former president's ear.
Exactly, David. This committee has been at work for a year now, and we are getting a sense of the fruits of that labor. While live witnesses are generally considered to be better, more dramatic, these tape depositions, these videotape depositions inside the Trump inner circle gives you a sense of their working reality. They have been calling in witness after witness after witness from the Trump White House, the Trump campaign, the Trump family, to take the American people inside that inner circle. And it does look as if their work has borne fruit. These are the facts.
I now welcome our second panel of witnesses. We're joined today by B.J. Pack, Al Smith, and Ben Ginsberg. Mr. Pack is the former United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. Mr. Smith is a former city commissioner for the city of Philadelphia, where he served for more than 10 years. Mr. Ginsberg is one of the leading election law attorneys in the country and has represented Republican presidential candidates in election litigation dating back to 2000, where he represented George W. Bush in the Bush v. Gore litigation. I will now swear in our witnesses. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm on the penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before the break, I think you all heard Mr. Barr and Mr. Donahue talk about the false claims that Mr. Trump and his supporters made about suitcases of fake ballots in Georgia. We have a witness here today who thoroughly investigated that issue. Mr. Pack, I want to thank you for appearing before us today. You were appointed by President Trump to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia, and you served from 2017 until January of 2021. You were the lead federal prosecutor there and worked for the Department of Justice under then Attorney General Bill Barr. Now, were you ever asked by Attorney General Barr to investigate claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election? And if so, what were those claims?
Thank you, Congressman Lofgren. Thank you for the question. Approximately December 4th, I believe, of 2020, Attorney General Barr and I had a conversation about an unrelated case to the case at issue. At the end of the conversation, Mr. Barr had asked me if I had seen a certain videotape that was being reported in the news where Mr. Giuliani, in a Senate subcommittee hearing that was held the day before, May 3rd, showed a videotape of a purportedly a security tape at the State Farm Arena in Atlanta, which is also in Fulton County in the city of Atlanta. Yes. At the time, Mr. Barr asked me that he had made a public statement that he had not seen any widespread election fraud that would question the outcome of the election. And because of the videotape and the serious allegation that Mr. Giuliani was making with respect to the suitcase full of ballots purported in the video, he asked me to find out what I could about it, because he had envisioned that in some days after our call that he was going to go to the White House for a meeting, and then that issue might come up. He asked me to make it a priority to get to the bottom of, to try to substantiate the allegation made by Mr. Giuliani.
Thank you. I understand the Georgia Secretary of State's office investigated those State Farm arena allegations and didn't find any evidence of fraud. What did you find when your office conducted its own investigation?
We found that the suitcase full of ballots, the alleged black suitcase that was being seen pulled from under the table, was actually an official lockbox where ballots were kept safe. We found out that there was a mistake in terms of a misunderstanding that they were done counting ballots or tallying ballots for the night, and the partisan watchers that was assigned by each of the respective parties were announced to send home. But once they realized the mistake, someone from the Secretary of State's office had indicated that, no, we're not done for the night. You need to go ahead and continue counting. So once they packed up the lockbox full of ballots, they brought back the official ballot box again and continued to tally the ballots from the lockbox. Unfortunately, during the Senate hearing, Mr. Giuliani only played a clip that showed them pulling out the official ballot box from under the table and referring to that as a smoking gun of fraud in Fulton County. But in actuality, in review of the entire video, it showed that that was actually an official ballot box that was kept underneath the tables. And then we saw them pack up because the announcement that they thought they were done for the night. And then once the announcement was made that you should continue counting, they brought the ballot box back out and they continued to count. The FBI interviewed the individuals that are depicted in the videos that purportedly were double, triple counting of the ballots, and determined that nothing irregular happened in the counting, and the allegations made by Mr. Giuliani were false.
Thank you very much. I'd like to play again a testimony from Mr. Donahue, who appeared before the committee before today.
Mr. Donahue, we talked at some length about whether or not the White House or the president was informed about the Antrim report. On the results of the investigations, the interviews that have gone on Fulton County, how would those results have been communicated to the White House, to the president?
I don't know how they were initially communicated. I do know that they came up in subsequent conversations with the president, and Dag Rose and I essentially told him we looked into that, and it's just not true.
Okay, so he was informed.
I told the president myself that several times in several conversations, that these allegations about ballots being smuggled in a suitcase and run through the machine several times, it was not true. That we looked at the video, we interviewed the witnesses, it was not true.
Mr. Pack, after you left the U.S. Attorney's Office on January 4th, 2021, did the next U.S. Attorney there, I think Mr. Trump's personal pick, Bobby Christine, did he investigate any remaining claims of fraud? And if so, did he find any evidence that supported the president's claims of voter fraud?
It is my understanding that Mr. Christine continued any investigations that were pending at the time of my departure, but he was unable to find any evidence of fraud that affected the outcome of the election.
So after investigating the president's and Mr. Giuliani's claims about voter fraud in Georgia, is it your view today that there was no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to undermine confidence in the outcome of the election in Georgia?
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Pack. And I want to thank you also for the service that you've given to our country. We appreciate that. Next, I'd like to turn to President Trump's false allegations about election integrity in Philadelphia. The Attorney General discussed these allegations at some length.
You know, the idea, the president has repeatedly suggested that there was some kind of outpouring of unexpected votes in inner city areas like Philadelphia as recently as January 13th when he walked off the NPR set. He was asked by the interviewer, what's your evidence of fraud? And he said more people voted in Philadelphia than there were voters. And that was absolute rubbish. The turnout in Philadelphia was in line with the state's turnout. And in fact, it was not as as impressive as many suburban counties, and there was nothing strange about the Philadelphia turnout. It wasn't like there was all these unexpected votes that came out in Philadelphia. So, I think once you actually look at the votes, and then there's an obvious explanation. For example, in Pennsylvania, Trump ran weaker than the Republican ticket generally. He ran weaker than two of the state candidates. He ran weaker than the congressional delegation running for federal Congress, and he ran weaker than the Republican, I think. I haven't looked at this recently, but he generally was a weak element on the Republican ticket. So that does not suggest that the election was stolen by fraud.
How about Pennsylvania and Bill McSwain? We were talking to the U.S. Attorney in Philadelphia about an alleged discrepancy between the number of absentee ballots issued and the number of ballots cast.
Right. So that was one of the big ones for a period of time. I think that was raised at Gettysburg by Giuliani or something like that. But it kept on being repeated, and I found it annoying because it didn't seem that it was right. So I called McSwain, and he got back to me. He said, no, the problem is that Mastriano threw out this number, and what he did was he mixed apples and oranges. He took the number of applications for the Republican primary, and he compared it to the number of absentee votes cast in the general election. But once you actually go and look and compare apples to apples, there's no discrepancy at all. And, that's one of the, I think at some point I covered that with the president.
We have another witness here today who has detailed knowledge about the election process in Philadelphia. Mr. Schmidt, at the time of the 2020 presidential election, you were serving as the only Republican member of Philadelphia's three-member city commission, which is responsible for overseeing elections throughout the city. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressperson.
So President Trump made numerous claims regarding fraudulent voting practices in Philadelphia, including the claim that dead people were voting. In fact, Mr. Giuliani told Pennsylvania state legislators that 8,000 dead people voted in Pennsylvania. You investigated those claims of voter fraud. Can you tell us what you found?
Not only was there not evidence of 8,000 dead voters voting in Pennsylvania, there wasn't evidence of 8. We took seriously every case that was referred to us, no matter how fantastical, no matter how absurd, and took every one of those seriously, including these.
As it turns out, even Mr. Trump's campaign lawyers knew that the dead voter claims weren't valid.
I guess the crooks in Philadelphia are disappointed in this. They only submitted 8,021 ballots from dead people, mail-in ballots for dead people. It's probably easier for dead people to submit mail-in ballots than it is to vote in person.
Rudy was at this stage of his life and the same ability to manage things at this level or not. And obviously, I think Bernie Kerik publicly said it. They never proved the allegations that they were making, and they were trying to develop.
Mr. Schmidt, on November 11th, 2020, President Trump tweeted about you, saying, and here's a quote, "A guy named Al Schmidt, a Philadelphia commissioner and so-called Republican, or rhino, is being used big time by the fake news media to explain how honest things were with respect to the election in Philadelphia. He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption, dishonesty. We win." As a result of that tweet and the CNN interview you gave where you stated the dead voter claims in Pennsylvania were false, you and your staff were subjected to disturbing threats. Can you tell us about that?
The threats prior to that tweet, and on some level it feels almost silly to talk about a tweet, but we can really see the impact that they have, because prior to that, the threats were pretty general in nature. Corrupt election officials in Philadelphia are going to get what's coming to them. You're what the Second Amendment is for. You're walking into the lion's den, all sorts of things like that. After the president tweeted at me by name, calling me out the way that he did, the threats became much more specific, much more graphic, and included not just me by name, but included members of my family by name, their ages, our address, pictures of our home, just every bit of detail that you could imagine. That was what changed with that tweet.
Behind me are redacted threats that you received, that you provided to the committee. Now, we redacted portions of the text to protect your family. Mr. Schmidt, I think I speak for all of my colleagues when I say we are deeply sorry for what you and your loved ones have been through. And I also want to thank you for your service to your country and for standing up for the rule of law. I want to thank both Mr. Pack and Mr. Schmidt for their service, their testimony, and for standing up for the rule of law. Now, I'd like to turn to another subject. The courts in our country provide a legitimate venue for campaigns to challenge what they view as irregular election practices. Now, courts have the final say on how the law applies to those challenges. We have a renowned legal expert here to address the Trump campaign's activities in court. Mr. Ginsburg, you've spent your entire career representing Republicans in election-related litigation. You served as the National Counsel on Republican presidential campaigns in 2000, in 2004, and in 2012. You played a key role in the 2000 Florida recount that led to the Supreme Court's decision in Bush v. Gore. You served as the co-chair of the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. I think it's fair to say you're the most prominent Republican lawyer who's litigated in the election field. Now, you've analyzed the Trump campaign's litigation pretty carefully. What's the normal process for post-election litigation? How is the Trump campaign's different from the kinds of post-election litigation you've been involved in and know about?
In the normal course of things, any campaign on the night of the election and the days after will do a couple of different things. One is that they'll analyze precinct results to look for abnormalities in the results, and they'll send people to those precincts to ask more questions. Secondly, all campaigns will have poll watchers and poll workers and observers in the polling place. And so campaigns will talk to those people if they saw any irregularities that could cause problems in the election. Now, the Trump campaign talked pre-election about having 50,000 poll workers. So presumably, they did have eyes on the ground in all these places. And so in the normal course of things, a campaign will analyze the reports that come in. Trump campaign had a couple of basic problems, however. Number one, the 2020 election was not close. In 2000, that was 537 and close. In this election, the most narrow margin was 10,000 and something in Arizona, and you just don't make up those sorts of numbers in recounts. And when the claims of fraud and irregularities were made, you've heard very compelling testimony from Mr. Stepien, from Matt Morgan, from Alex Cannon about those claims and how they didn't believe them. And so that put the Trump campaign on sort of a process of bringing cases without the actual evidence that you have to have in which the process is designed to bring out.
So are you aware of any instance in which a court found the Trump campaign's fraud claims to be credible?
No, there was never that instance. In all the cases that were brought, and I've looked at the more than 60 that include more than 180 counts, and no, the simple fact is that the Trump campaign did not make its case.
The Select Committee has identified 62 post-election lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign and his allies. between November 4th, 2020 and January 6th, 2021. Those cases resulted in 61 losses and only a single victory, which actually didn't affect the outcome for either candidate. Despite those 61 losses, President Trump and his allies claim that the courts refused to hear them out, and as a result, they never had their day in court. Mr. Ginsburg, what do you say about the claims that Mr. Trump wasn't given an opportunity to provide the evidence they had of voter fraud? Did they have their day in court?
They did have their day in court. About half of those cases that you mentioned were dismissed at the procedural stage for a lack of standing. The proper people didn't bring the case, or there wasn't sufficient evidence and it got dismissed on a motion to dismiss. But in the other, there was discussion of the merits that was contained in the complaints. And in no instance did a court find that the charges of fraud were real. And it's also worth noting that even if the Trump campaign complained that it did not have its day in court, there have been post-election reviews in each of the 6 battleground states that could have made a difference. And those ranged from the somewhat farcical Cyber Ninjas case in Arizona to the Michigan Senate report that was mentioned earlier, the hand recount in Georgia that Mr. Pack addressed. And in each one of those instances, there was no credible evidence of fraud produced by the Trump campaign or his supporters.
Thank you. You know, as Mr. Ginsburg has explained, there are no cases where the Trump campaign was able to convince a court that there was widespread fraud or irregularities in the 2020 election. Over and over, judges appointed by Democrats and Republicans alike directly refuted this false narrative. They called out the Trump campaign's lack of evidence for its claims, and the judges did that even in cases where they could have simply thrown out the lawsuit without writing a word. You can see behind me a few excerpts from the decisions in these 62 cases. The Trump campaign's lack of evidence was criticized by judges across the political spectrum. In Pennsylvania, a Trump-appointed judge concluded, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here." Another Trump-appointed judge warned that if cases like these succeeded, quote, "Any disappointed loser in a presidential election able to hire a team of clever lawyers could flag claimed deviations from election results and cast doubt on election results." The list goes on and on. Allegations are called, quote, "an amalgamation of theories, conjecture, and speculation." In another, strained legal arguments without merit, unsupported by evidence, derived from wholly unreliable sources, a fundamental and obvious misreading of the Constitution. The rejection of President Trump's litigation efforts was overwhelming. 22 federal judges appointed by Republican presidents, including 10 appointed by President Trump himself, and at least 24 elected or appointed Republican state judges dismissed the president's claims. At least 11 lawyers have been referred for disciplinary proceedings due to bad faith and baseless efforts to undermine the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Rudy Giuliani had his license to practice law suspended in New York. And just this week, a newly filed complaint will potentially make his suspension from practicing law in D.C. permanent. And as we've just heard from perhaps the most preeminent Republican election lawyer in recent history, the Trump campaign's unprecedented effort to overturn its election laws in court was a deeply damaging abuse of the judicial process. As stated by U.S. District Court Judge David Carter, this was, quote, "a coup in search of a legal theory." Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. The members of the Select Committee may have additional questions for today's witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. Without objection, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The second panel of witnesses is now dismissed. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Lofgren, for a closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now that we understand the litigation efforts by President Trump and his allies, I'd like to present additional actions taken by the Trump campaign during this time. President Trump continued to push the stolen election narrative, even though he and his allies knew that their litigation efforts making the same claim had failed. Now, it's worth pointing out that litigation generally does not continue past the safe harbor date of December 14th. But the fact that this litigation went on, well, that decision makes more sense when you consider the Trump campaign's fundraising tactics. Because if the litigation had stopped on December 14th, there would have been no fight to defend the election and no clear path to continue to raise millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, at this time, I'd ask for unanimous consent to include in the record a video presentation describing how President Trump used the lies he told to raise millions of dollars from the American people. These fundraising schemes were also part of the effort to disseminate the false claims of election fraud.
Without objection, so.
My name is Amanda Wick, and I'm Senior Investigative Counsel with the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Between Election Day and January 6th, the Trump campaign sent millions of fundraising emails to Trump supporters, sometimes as many as 25 a day. The emails claimed the, quote, left-wing mob was undermining the election, implored supporters to, quote, step up to protect the integrity of the election, and encouraged them to, quote, fight back. But as the Select Committee has demonstrated, the Trump campaign knew these claims of voter fraud were false, yet they continued to barrage small-dollar donors with emails, encouraging them to donate to something called the Official Election Defense Fund. The Select Committee discovered no such fund existed.
I don't believe there is actually a fund called the Election Defense Fund.
Is it fair to say that the Election Defense Fund was another, I think we called it a marketing tactic? Yes. And tell us about these funds as marketing tactics.
Just a topic matter where money could potentially go to be, how money could potentially be used.
The claims that the election was stolen were so successful, President Trump and his allies raised $250 million, nearly $100 million in the first week after the election. On November 9th, 2020, President Trump created a separate entity called the Save America PAC. Most of the money raised went to this newly created PAC, not to election-related litigation. The Select Committee discovered that the Save America PAC made millions of dollars of contributions to pro-Trump organizations, including $1 million to Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' charitable foundation, $1 million to the America First Policy Institute, a conservative organization which employs several former Trump administration officials, $204,857 to the Trump Hotel Collection, and over $5 million to Event Strategies, Inc., the company that ran President Trump's January 6th rally on the Ellipse.
All of us here today do not want to see our election victory stolen by emboldened radical left Democrats, which is what they're doing.
The evidence developed by the Select Committee highlights how the Trump campaign aggressively pushed false election claims to fundraise, telling supporters it would be used to fight voter fraud that did not exist. The emails continued through January 6th, even as President Trump spoke on the Ellipse. 30 minutes after the last fundraising email was sent, the Capitol was breached.
Every American is entitled and encouraged to participate in our electoral process. Political fundraising is part of that. Small dollar donors use scarce disposable income to support candidates and causes of their choosing, to make their voices heard. And those donors deserve the truth about what those funds will be used for. Throughout the committee's investigation, we found evidence that the Trump campaign and its surrogates misled donors as to where their funds would go and what they would be used for. So not only was there the big lie, there was the big ripoff. Donors deserve to know where their funds are really going. They deserve better than what President Trump and his team did. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank all of our witnesses today. And I'd also like to, in particular, wish Mr. Stepien and his family all the best on the arrival of a new baby. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, was very narrowly focused. And in the coming days, you will see the committee move on to President Trump's broader planning for January 6th, including his plan to corrupt the Department of Justice and his detailed planning with lawyer John Eastman to pressure the Vice President, state legislatures, state officials, and others to overturn the election. Let me leave you today with one clip to preview what you will see in one of our hearings to come. This is the testimony of White House lawyer Eric Hirschman. John Eastman called Mr. Hirschman the day after January 6th, and here is how that conversation went.
I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear two words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
At the conclusion of last week's hearing, we showed you a video of rioters explaining why they had come to Washington on January 6th. It was because Donald Trump told them to be here. Today we heard about some of the lies Donald Trump embraced and amplified when it became clear he didn't have the numbers of votes to win the election. We heard about how officials at different levels of government explored claims of fraud and found no evidence, yet the former president continued to repeat those false claims over and over again. Today, we'll end things where we did on Thursday, back on January 6th, hearing words of individuals who wanted to stop the transfer of power. We know they were there because of Donald Trump. Now we hear some of the things they believed. Without objection, I enter into the record a video presentation.
I know exactly what's going on right now. Fake election. They think they're gonna fucking cheat us out of our vote and put communist fucking Biden in office. It ain't fucking happening today, buddy. You voted?
Yes, sir.
How'd it go?
Voted early. It went well, except for the can't really trust the software. Dominion software all over.
We voted, and right in the top right-hand corner of the Dominion voting machine that we used, there was a Wi-Fi symbol with 5 bars. So that most definitely connected to the internet, without a doubt. So they stole that from us twice. We're not doing it anymore. We're not taking it anymore. So we're standing up, we're here, and whatever happens, we're not laying down again.
I'm from Pennsylvania. It didn't work. It absolutely worked. It didn't work. No. Trust the system. 200,000 people that weren't even registered voted. 430,000 votes disappeared from President Trump's tally. And you can't stand there and tell me that it worked.
I don't want to say that what we're doing is right. But if the election's being stolen, what is it going to take?
The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
The chairman, Benny Thompson, wrapping up the second of the January 6th hearings before the American people. A remarkable day unfolding here. The level of detail and insight into former President Trump's, not only his White House team, his campaign team, his family on election night and in the days and weeks that followed the election. The committee trying to make the case today that there were a number of people surrounding the former president, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, his campaign chief, Bill Stepien, among others, who told him on election night not to declare victory. Of course, we saw the video reminded of the fact that he came out before the American people and declared fraud instead. The second half of this hearing making the case that the former president had every right, as have candidates all throughout our history, to question the results, to explore legal avenues for those questions that you might have, but that at every turn, judges, both appointed by Republicans and by Democrats, said you simply do not have evidence here to support any notion of widespread fraud. And again, that moment with Bill Barr, the Attorney General, a fiercely loyal Attorney General for much of his time while serving the president, saying in the very end, sitting with the president at the White House, I was somewhat demoralized because I thought, boy, if he really believes this stuff, this is in the weeks following the election, that he has lost contact. He's become detached from reality if he really believes this stuff. I want to bring in our chief Washington correspondent, Jonathan Karl. John, were they effective today?
David, this committee is trying to set the record straight on January 6th. And setting the record straight about what happened on January 6th means setting the record straight about what happened in the election. Because the people, the mob that invaded that Capitol building did so because they believed Trump's lies that the election had been stolen. So did they make their case? I think they made their case by going in methodically and in detail about what happened during the election and in the aftermath, looking specifically at the allegations that Donald Trump was making about election fraud, not just generally, but very specifically. You heard about the alleged idea of a suitcase being brought out underneath a table in Georgia, about ballot dumps in Michigan, about dead people voting in Pennsylvania, and on and on and on. And what you saw today, not the committee speaking, but people close to Donald Trump, people put in a position of authority by Donald Trump, who said they looked into these allegations, they studied them, they investigated them, and they found out that they were not true. So did they make their case? I think they did.
John Karl live on the Hill for us. John, thank you. I want to bring in Terry Moran. And Terry, you and I both interacted with Ben Ginsberg, well-known Republican lawyer who has worked for multiple campaigns throughout the years, actually fighting the fight for them after elections, as they have every right to do in every presidential election and every other race down the ballot. He made the case this afternoon that the Trump campaign had every right to ask questions. They did, and they got their answers. They simply didn't accept them.
They didn't. Ben Ginsberg is a political professional, as we've always had in this country. Someone who knows the system, who knows how to work it, who knows how to contest results. And he knows that under our Constitution and laws, the kinds of claims that he has litigated before, most famously in 2000 when he was part of George W. Bush's ultimately victorious team in the challenge to that election, those disputes get resolved in our courts. Under rules of evidence developed over centuries to distinguish truth from falsehood, fact from baloney. And he came into this hearing to say, this is how it goes. This is how campaigns operate when they sense that maybe something was wrong, that the count was wrong. And his utter dismissal of the fantasies, the lies that were spilling out of the White House is another voice from inside the Republican Party. You realize there was no one from the Democratic Party testifying today. These were all inside Trump's inner circle or in the Republican Party, people who aren't running for re-election, but who know how our politics work, know how our elections work, and they made a case that Donald Trump was defying it and degrading our elections because of it.
Terry Moran watching the hearing with us today. Terry, thank you, as always. I want to bring in Kate Shaw just to pick up on that point. And Kate, you heard this second part of the hearing today was meant to remind not only the American people, but in particular some of the former president's supporters who had claimed they never had their day in court, that in fact they did in multiple courtrooms in front of multiple judges across the country. They quoted a number of Republican-appointed judges, this committee did, and with reason, obviously, and they brought up the more than 60 cases that you brought up during the recess a little earlier in the day to show that the legal system worked just as it should after every election.
That's right, and I did think that Republican election lawyer Ben Ginsburg, who, as you and Terry were just saying, is, probably the most prominent Republican election lawyer of his generation, say unequivocally that these claims were vetted in court and that judges, both state and federal, both Democratic and Republican, took a look at many of these cases, on the merits, looking closely at the facts, and found no evidence of widespread fraud. And, it's in addition to courts, it's also the case that other institutions of state government took a look, right? You had recounts in a number of states. You had officials, both state and federal, review claims that were made, take them all very seriously, and in each and every instance, thoroughly, refute any claims that there was serious or widespread fraud. And so I thought that Ginsburg, but all of the witnesses today were, short but really unequivocal that these claims were just start to finish baseless.
And Kate, just again, a quick follow to that, because they made the point several times today that it wasn't just one state that the Trump campaign would have to overturn. It was multiple states, and in the state where it was the closest, Georgia, they actually had multiple reviews, including that hand recount.
That's right. So, the Trump campaign, I think, knew very well that it was facing very difficult math in order to flip enough states because of the Electoral College to overcome Joe Biden's edge. And so it would have, I think, needed to be a minimum of 3 states. So you saw very intense fixation on Georgia, on Arizona, on Wisconsin, where the margins were relatively close, but you would have had to flip all of them, and in no case were the margins close enough that a recount under really any circumstances might have changed the outcome. As Ginsburg said, typically recounts will change a couple hundred votes, but not in the thousands, which is what the Trump campaign would have needed to make up. And, in Arizona, where there was that additional recount in 2021, put on basically by President Trump supporters, the end of the day of months and millions of dollars, there were several hundred additional Biden votes found, and that was the result of that protracted recount effort. So the results either stayed the same or in some instances favored Biden further.
All right, thanks, Kate. Kate Shaw with us again today. Thank you. Let's bring in Pierre Thomas quickly. Pierre, the focus in this next hearing turns to Attorney General Bill Barr, a key witness in his deposition, particularly with his willingness to speak truth to the former president. This is what the committee continues to show the American people. And in particular, there was one point that he made that in looking at the vote in Pennsylvania, he said the former president performed much worse than other Republicans down the ballot. They actually had a decent election night in Pennsylvania. And he said that's just one more indicator that he didn't believe there was any widespread fraud in Pennsylvania to be found, because other Republicans, quite frankly, did very well.
David, everywhere you turn in today's hearing, you see that these claims were just plain bogus. And you saw the FBI have to go out and look at the situation in Georgia, actually asking questions about a suitcase full of, fraudulent votes. It just was pure fiction, and they knew it, but they had the time, take the time to go and look at these allegations. And what you're going to see coming up Wednesday, David, is President Trump putting unprecedented pressure on DOJ to find facts to suit him.
Pierre Thomas with us at our Washington Bureau. Pierre, thank you. Of course, Pierre will be with us Wednesday. Again, the focus of Wednesday's hearing will be not only the Attorney General Bill Barr, but other members of the Justice Department, and this continuing pressure on the Justice Department to do something in the weeks following the election. Again, the next hearing is set for Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll be here for that. Our entire team will be standing by. Our coverage will continue today, ABC News Live, abcnews.com, and I'll be back with the entire team for World News Tonight a little later today. For many of you, you'll check in with your local news teams now and this afternoon. And of course, we'll see you right after, a little later today. I'm David Muir, New York. Good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
And
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. Thanks so much for streaming with us. You have been watching our continuing coverage of the second January 6th hearing into the attack on our nation's Capitol. Committee Chairman Betty Thomas saying in today's opening statements that former President Trump continued to spread lies about winning the election against President Biden, despite being told repeatedly that he had lost.
This morning, we'll tell the story of how Donald Trump lost an election and knew he lost an election, and as a result of his loss, decided to wage an attack on our democracy, an attack on the American people by trying to rob you of your voice in our democracy, and in doing so, lit the fuse that led to the horrific violence of January 6th, when a mob of his supporters stormed the Capitol sent by Donald Trump to stop the transfer of power.
Today's star witness, Trump's 2020 campaign manager, Bill Stepien. He was able to testify because he wasn't actually able to testify, rather, because his wife went into labor, delaying the start of the hearing. We're going to have full team coverage. But first, let's bring in White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks live on Capitol Hill for more. Mary Alice, let's just start with key takeaways for you from what you heard today.
Well, Kira, one of the key takeaways actually still came from Bill Stepien. Even though he was not in the room, he had talked before to the committee in a taped deposition. And so the committee played numerous clips of that deposition. And one moment was so interesting. He was there on tape saying that on election night, he advised President Trump, as his campaign manager, he advised President Trump to be prudent, to not go out and make claims about the election results because votes were still coming in, that he hadn't seen any suggestions or any signs of fraud at that point, but that the former president just did not listen. You could see on that tape how frustrated he was, how upset he was in that moment when he basically said that his advice was ignored. And then the committee played clips of the former president going before the cameras on election night and making these unbelievable and baseless claims of election fraud. You know, as they ticked through those weeks right after the election, Kira, they continued to show that it wasn't just the campaign. It was Pence's team, it was DOJ, all looking into possible allegations of fraud, but just not coming up with any of it. And then, of course, they took the story to the states and talked also to state election officials who also stood by what they saw on the ground.
And Terry, just to follow up with that, administration officials, some in Trump's inner circle, his closest advisors, called some of Trump's false claims of fraud idiotic, crazy, even nuts. Let's listen to some of former AG Bill Barr's testimony on that.
You know, after the election, as of November 7th, in your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None.
So, Terry, what did you make of Barr's testimony?
Well, it's devastating to President Trump's, former President Trump's case, because this is his handpicked attorney general who had already demonstrated a great deal of loyalty to Donald Trump, and in fact had charged U.S. attorneys across the country, go look for evidence of fraud in your districts. Now, that actually violated Department of Justice policy, which has said don't investigate charges of fraud while the election is still being contested. Do it afterwards. But Barr said go do it, and they didn't find it. And so to hear in this way, insiders, certainly Barr, but others as well, as Mary was pointing out, Mary Alice was pointing out, from all these different parts of Trump's life, Trump campaign, the Trump administration, the Trump family. This hearing took us into that inner circle in a unique way, and also into the workings of this committee. Yes, live witnesses are more dramatic, but these tape depositions that you saw their workaday reality, digging, witness after witness after witness. And what they've done is lay out a historical record today that inside Trump's inner circle, people could see reality, and he refused to.
And let's take it now to Rachel Scott on the Hill. Rachel, we heard Fox News editorial director Chris Stirewalt actually say Trump had no basis for declaring victory on election night. Let's take a look at that moment once again.
You know, after the election, as of November 7th, In your judgment, what were the chances of President Trump winning the election?
After that point?
Yes.
None.
And Trump campaign manager Bill Stepien even said it was far too early to make that call. Rachel, what do you make of that exchange?
Well, it doesn't get more direct than that, none. And I think what we saw today, as Terry just pointed out, this rare behind-the-scenes look at what was actually happening. Here, I remember being on the air many times with you as we were covering the election results coming in and the former president making these false claims. And so many of us wondered what was playing out behind the scenes, what was playing out in Trump's inner circle. And to hear today that the former president was not even listening to his campaign advisor, who described himself as being on team normal in terms of where they were in terms of believing the election results that were coming in versus where the former president and people like Rudy Giuliani were, which was pushing these false claims about the 2020 election. It is stark. This was really revealing and enlightening testimony today that the committee put it forward.
Yeah, it's all coming forward. Those many a days we were on the air for hours at a time. Chief Washington correspondent John Carl, we also heard testimony that Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani was actually intoxicated when discussing what the president should say on election night. I mean, it really is just bringing everything forward on just how significant of a role all of these people played that night.
I mean, the fact of Rudy Giuliani being intoxicated on election night isn't all that surprising, but what was surprising is to hear people really in the Trump inner circle at the top levels of the campaign speaking openly about the fact that Rudy Giuliani was intoxicated. And the point of that is not just a commentary on Rudy Giuliani's drinking habits, is that was the one person Donald Trump listened to on election night, was the intoxicated Rudy Giuliani. The other top officials on that campaign, the campaign manager, the campaign chief strategist, Jason Miller, even the feeling of members of the Trump family was that the election was not, the counting of the votes was not over. Donald Trump had not won the election. In fact, it was trending the wrong way, and he should not go out and declare victory. The only person that was telling him that he should go out and declare victory was Rudy Giuliani. And what did he do? Well, Trump went out at 2:30 in the morning and he declared victory. Frankly, we did win this election. That, you know, Kira, I believe that if you look at the totality of the events leading up to January 6th, that you could argue that speech that Donald Trump made at 2:30 in the morning on election night, where he declared victory as votes were still being counted, declared victory in a race that he was clearly not winning, that may have been the most dangerous speech that Donald Trump ever gave, more dangerous than the speech that he gave on January 6th at the Ellipse. I mean, by that time, you know, those people were already here and they were riled up by these claims that the election had been stolen, riled up by a process that began with Donald Trump declaring victory on election night.
And again, claims that, bottom line, have been proven to be absolutely baseless. Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, AG Bill Barr, said he told Trump the Department of Justice is not an extension of his legal team. Let's talk about why that was so important to hear.
Well, it's important because of who Bill Barr is. Recall, he was an attorney general who had been very loyal to the president, who, in fact, before the election had suggested that perhaps people should be concerned about mail-in ballots, even though there was no evidence that that was going to be a problem. We had pressed him on that very question on numerous broadcasts for ABC News. And here we are. Bill Barr, after the election, directs the U.S. attorneys to go out and see if they found any evidence of significant fraud in their particular jurisdictions, which had been a change from previous Justice Department policy not to really get involved when the votes were still being sort of contested. And they came back with nothing. Bottom line, they came out with nothing that was consequential in terms of significant election fraud. And at that point, Bill Barr felt the obligation to inform the president of such. He told the president it was basically BS, as he said. I'll be proper in my language here. And the president simply was not taking yes for an answer.
It's one thing you always are, and that is very proper. Pierre, thank you. Rick Klein, our ABC News political director, former President Trump and his allies still spreading these false claims, even to this day. Will this testimony be enough to change minds?
Yeah, look, Kira, I think the fact that the former president is out there, the fact that many of his followers are out there, underscore the urgency of the moment, that this is not something that happened a year and a half ago when it was a one-off. These are issues and theories and falsehoods that continue to be relevant right now in politics. We've got candidates on the ballot just tomorrow in Nevada and South Carolina who deny the legitimacy of the last election. In one case, the potential Secretary of State of Nevada. So this remains as relevant as ever, and that's why a lot of this work is as urgent as it is.
All right, Barbara Comstock, also one of our contributors and also former Republican Congresswoman from Virginia. Why didn't all these people speak out publicly and do it earlier?
Yeah, that probably is one of the most disappointing things as you listen to it, because they enabled Trump's lies in real time by not speaking out publicly. But I do think what these hearings are showing very clearly is from the start of election night and even before, Trump declared fraud based on nothing except the ramblings of an apparently drunk Rudy Giuliani. And everybody in his orbit, that's what's so powerful about these hearings. All the Republicans on his campaign, his family, his Justice Department, the campaign lawyers, these are people who wanted to continue to be in the White House or be in power. They all told him in real time he lost. And I know, Jonathan Karl heard that, from many sources, reporters, heard that off the record. I heard that from people close to Trump, that they knew he lost, but let's just ease him through this. Well, easing him through it and denying it didn't work. And as a result, on January 6th, this greatest assault on our Capitol, and police officers who died as a result of that, and the violence and the outcome that we're still experiencing, and the threat that still exists from Donald Trump, as the reporters have pointed out, people on the ballot. And Bill Stepien himself, I mean, God bless him, I hope the baby's healthy and everything there. But why on earth is he working with Donald Trump and Harriet Hagman? Permanent shame on him. His lawyer put out a statement saying, oh, he doesn't tell people to promote the big lie. He's working for the big lie. There's no running away from that. And, regardless of any legal liability, he should be ashamed of himself politically.
Point well made. Barbara, thank you. And finally, Chief Executive Officer of Democracy for America, Yvette Simpson, joining us now. Yvette, I'm going to let you bring it all full circle here. Anything specifically out of everything that you listened to and watched today, what stood out to you?
I think the big thing is we all saw this thing happen, a year and a half ago. We watched a violent attack on our country. We watched people storm the Capitol who had been told that the election was stolen. Today is just, I think, the evidence for people to see that there was a months-long conspiracy, that a lot of people were entangled. So many people who had the power to stop this thing. So many people who, as you said before with Barbara, could have come forward. The idea that something like this could happen in our country and still reverberate today. The fact that as a result of this, many states have passed laws that are going to keep people from voting in this election and in elections in the future. That there are people who still believe that the election was stolen and are planning probably another similar attack in the future. That this has changed so much the way our democracy functions. That people believe that they have the power to overturn an election. So for me, I know that people have fatigue, right? We went through hearings for impeachment. There was no accountability. I hope that people don't have fatigue here, that they watch every single day of this to know that this happened in America, that there were a lot of people involved. And I hope that every single one of them is held accountable.
Thank you all for incredible team coverage. Yvette, and you wrapping it up for us. Coming up, inside the hearings, live with the former Chief Minority Counsel for the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Stay with us.
America's #1 news, ABC News. Most watched, most trusted, and streaming live to you anytime, anywhere, and free. This is ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Free to you 24/7. Watch America's #1 news whenever you want it, wherever you are, anytime. ABC News Live, streaming live and free on all platforms. More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. Take America's #1 news with you anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now. It's Elvis Week on GMA with the stars of the movie and Priscilla.
Good morning, America.
And Chris, Kiki, Antonio, Jeff, Haley, and Pitbull. All on GMA.
We know who we are, where we come from, and where we belong.
This is the story of how we lived, how we survived for thousands of years.
We're still maintaining our culture, and we're fighting for it, generation after generation.
It's important to pass these skills on.
We make it work out here.
Something very beautiful about it.
What do you want the world to know about Hunter Biden?
GMA tomorrow.
At what point in your marriage did you realize that Hunter had a drinking problem?
Exclusive.
What has, if anything, Hunter said about you writing this book?
The emotional and deeply personal first TV interview.
This is not a story about who's right and who's wrong. This is my story, the story of Kathleen Buell.
Breaks tomorrow on Good Morning America. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
Welcome back, and so glad you're with us. During our January 6th hearing coverage, we want to talk about the legal implications of all of this now. We're bringing in former Chief Minority Counsel for the U.S. Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, Jeff Robbins. He's also a litigation partner at Saul Ewing, Arnstein, and Lair. Jeff, first of all, let me just get your thoughts, your impressions on how the hearing played out so far today.
Well, good afternoon, Kira. I mean, I'm glad that we're hearing about a team normal in the White House, quiescent and small team normal. But the problem is that the dominant team in this White House was Team Whack Job. And the captain of Team Whack Job was nobody other than the President of the United States, the leader of the free world. There was overwhelming evidence presented today that when the president stated that the election was stolen from him and that there was election fraud, he knew that that was false and that his claims to the contrary were simply fraudulent, that he was engaged, as the committee has said, in a fraud. So we're left with the choice that either the president of the United States was engaged in a massive fraud, a massive scam, or as Attorney General Barr speculated, that he was out to lunch or detached from reality, or perhaps that he was corrupt and he was detached from reality. None of those are wonderful choices when you're talking about the President of the United States, but that's what the evidence presented by this committee is tending to show.
Team Whack Job. I can already see the title of your book when it comes out after this is all wrapped up. So is the committee, you think, doing a good job at proving that Trump knew he lost the election and just wanted to push the big lie to just see how far he could get?
Well, it's hard to see that they could do a better job. I mean, they are piece by piece, item by item, clip after clip, testimony after testimony, showing that everybody concerned told him that he had lost the election, that his claims that it was stolen were fraudulent, that his conduct was fraudulent, that the litigation was fraudulent, that the efforts to pressure the vice president into not counting votes was baseless, and on and on and on it goes. And you know, the Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Garland, is going to have a monumental decision to make, a tough decision, which is going to have historical importance, to seek an indictment under the two criminal statutes that Judge Carter in California cited as potential criminal charges against then President Trump, or to not seek an indictment. he's going to be damned if he does, and he's going to be damned if he doesn't. On one hand, of course, the evidence that has been amassed of corrupt intent, dishonest intent, fraudulent intent on the part of former President Trump is overwhelming. And that's going to push DOJ lawyers hard when they decide whether or not to indict. On the other hand, of course, an indictment of a former president is going to have a tremendously divisive effect. But on the other hand, and I know we've run out of hands, failing to indict somebody about whom there's so much evidence of corrupt intent to block an election and more, to block election results, the counting of election results, to interfere with the counting of electoral votes, to interfere with the counting of votes in Georgia. There's just so much evidence that it leaves the Attorney General, as I say, with a very difficult choice. Do you indict and divide the country, or fail to indict and leave a historical record of that screams out, if not now, when?
This is going to leave a historical record of all kinds. Jeff Robbins, really appreciate your insight. You've been there, done that as an investigator. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Kira.
You bet. Coming up, not a day to look at your 401ks, by the way. A massive sell-off on Wall Street, what it means for your money right after this.
America's #1 news, ABC News. Most watched, most trusted, and streaming live to you anytime, anywhere, and free. This is ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news, free to you 24/7. Watch America's #1 news whenever you want it, wherever you are, anytime. ABC News Live, streaming live and free on all platforms. More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. Take America's #1 news with you, anywhere you go, anytime, free. Download the ABC News app now. Breaking news, exclusives, 24/7. There for you with one touch. The ABC News app. Download it now. It's Elvis Week on GMA with the stars of the movie and Priscilla.
Good morning, America.
And Chris, Kiki, Antonio, Jeff, Haley, and Pitbull. All on GMA.
We know who we are, where we come from, and where we belong.
This is the story of how we lived, how we survived for thousands of years.
We're still maintaining our culture, and we're fighting for it, generation after generation.
It's important to pass these skills on.
We make it work out here.
Something very beautiful about it.
What do you want the world to know about Hunter Biden?
GMA tomorrow.
At what point in your marriage did you realize that Hunter had a drinking problem?
Exclusive.
What has, if anything, Hunter said about you writing this book?
The emotional and deeply personal first TV interview.
This is not a story about who's right and who's wrong. This is my story, the story of Kathleen Buell.
Breaks tomorrow on Good Morning America.
Well, it was another rough day for Americans' wallets, with a lot of red on Wall Street today. That sell-off coming in part because of new concerns about rising interest rates and inflation, which is being blamed on a tight labor market, COVID, Russia's war in Ukraine, and too much government spending. There's your numbers now live. ABC News business reporter Alexis Christoforous joining me now to help us break it all down. So just explain today's sell-off, Alexis, if you don't mind, where the U.S. economy stands at this moment.
Well, certainly, take a look at that big board there at the New York Stock Exchange, an ugly way to start the week on Wall Street. It all goes back to what we learned on Friday, Kira. We had a disastrous inflation report. We saw that inflation is moving in the wrong direction. Instead of prices falling last month, they rose to a fresh 40-year high, up 8.6%. Not only is the Dow off more than 2% right now, the S&P 500, which a lot of folks use as sort of a benchmark for their investments, now in a bear market, meaning that that index has fallen 20% from its recent high. And the reasoning there is investors are betting the Federal Reserve will have to get more aggressive with interest rate hikes as it tries to rein in inflation.
So how concerned are you about a recession?
Well, you know, it's still very much a possibility, and the Fed is continuing to walk that tightrope. They need to raise interest rates enough to slow demand, just enough to not tip us into recession, but enough to start to bring those inflation numbers lower. And the Fed is already warning that that could mean the unemployment rate will start to climb in the weeks and months ahead.
So if you look at grocery prices, they're up nearly 12% from a year ago. Largest spike, eggs, meat, bread, since 1979. And then you've got gas prices nationwide. Now, on average, more than $5 a gallon. Is it true inflation will get worse before it gets better? I mean, that's what we always say, right?
Right. Well, economists do believe that that is the case. Sadly, some are now calling for gas at $6 a gallon nationwide by August. Rent is now up 26%. Groceries up 12%. Overall, Kira, Americans spending on average $341 more per month on groceries and other items they were spending on just last year. So it looks as though inflation is not trending in the right direction, and we could indeed get an interest rate hike of 0.75%, possibly even 1% this Wednesday when the Fed holds its policy setting meeting.
Alexis, thanks so much. I always appreciate your gut check and keeping us honest. Thanks, Alexis.
Thanks.
I'm Kira Phillips. Thanks so much for joining us. Remember, ABC News Live is here for you all day with the latest news, context, and analysis. And remember, ABC News Live is available on all your streaming devices as well, plus the ABC News app and on abcnews.com. We've got much more for you straight ahead. Don't go far.
This week on GMA with the stars of the movie and Priscilla.